That Christmas Eve, the most powerful man in the city knelt, not because of bullets, not because of betrayal, but because of a woman he hadn't looked at in 3 years. She had no gun, no power, only the truth. And sometimes the truth is more dangerous than any weapon in the world. If you're watching this video, please like it. Leave your city name in the comments. I want to know how far this story has come. Now, follow me to the end. You won't regret it. The snow had been falling since noon, but nobody inside the Moretti estate seemed to notice or care. That was the thing about wealth. It insulated you from everything. Cold, noise, consequence. The world outside could be drowning in ice, and the men gathered in Valerio Moretti's dining hall would still be sweating beneath their tailored jackets, drinking whiskey that cost more than most people's monthly rent, laughing at jokes that weren't funny because laughing was safer than silence when Valerio Moretti was in the room. Serafina Val noticed the snow. She always noticed things nobody else bothered to. She stood near the far end of the dining table with a crystal decanter in both hands, her back straight, her face arranged into the careful blankness she had spent 3 years perfecting. Pour. Step back. Don't make eye contact. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't exist in any way that makes the men around this table feel uncomfortable. She was good at not existing. Too good, probably. The dining hall was enormous, the kind of room that existed not because anyone needed that much space, but because space itself was a statement. Dark wood paneling ran floor to ceiling. Chandeliers the size of small cars hung above the long table, throwing warm golden light across the faces of 17 men who collectively controlled more of this city than any elected official ever would. The Christmas decorations had gone up 3 days ago at Valerio's instruction. Massive pine wreaths draped from every doorframe, a tree in each corner wrapped in gold ribbon, crystal ornaments catching the light like scattered stars. The estate looked like a fairy tale. It felt like a pressure cooker. Serafina moved around the table quietly, refilling glasses without interrupting the conversations flowing around her. To her left, Senator Hargrove was explaining his re-election strategy to a man named Donatello Ricci, who everyone called Don Nico, and who had personally ordered at least 4 deaths that Serafina knew about just from 3 years of carrying wine glasses and pretending to be furniture. Across the table, 2 of Valerio's younger captains, Marco Tessaro and a thick-set man with a gold tooth who went by Carmine, were arguing in low voices about a debt collection that had gone sideways somewhere in the East Docks. And at the head of the table, Valerio Moretti sat like a man who had forgotten why he built the room he was sitting in. Serafina had studied him the way you study weather, not because you could control it, but because ignoring it got people killed. She'd been watching him for 3 years. She knew the way his jaw tightened when something bored him, the way his right hand went still when he was actually dangerous, as opposed to the performative danger he wore like cologne most of the time. She knew he took his coffee black with exactly half a teaspoon of sugar, that he read 3 newspapers every morning before speaking to anyone, that he hadn't smiled, a real smile, not the cold thing he did with his mouth sometimes. And as long as she'd been here, tonight, Valerio looked like a man watching a party through soundproof glass. He was 41 years old and looked it in a way that money couldn't fix. Not because he was worn down, but because he was carved down. His face had the quality of something reduced to its essential structure. Dark eyes that didn't give anything away. A mouth that moved precisely, saying only what needed to be said. He wore a dark suit without a tie, top button open. The only concession to informality he apparently allowed himself. His hands rested on the table and he was watching the snow through the window behind Senator Hargrove's head. Not listening, not performing, just somewhere else entirely. Serafina filed that away. It wasn't her business. She lifted the decanter and moved 3 steps to her right to refill Carmine's glass. Told you, the Ferraro kid panicked, Carmine was saying to Marco. He's a liability. You handle it before New Year's or I will. You won't do a damn thing without Valerio's word, and you know it, Marco said quietly. Carmine's eyes flicked to Serafina as she poured. She kept her face empty and her gaze down. He dismissed her immediately, the way you dismiss a lamp. Speaking of entertainment, Carmine said, loudly enough that heads turned down the table, what are we doing for the gala this year? Don Valerio, you still doing the charity thing Christmas Eve? Valerio's eyes moved from the window, slowly. The Meridian Ballroom, same as every year. High society crowd, Marco said, leaning back in his chair. Politicians, those foundation people, the art crowd. He said it with a particular flavor of contempt. The boring crowd, Carmine agreed, and there was scattered laughter from the younger men at the table. Hey! He was grinning now, and Serafina recognized the quality of that grin. She'd seen it before. It was the kind of grin that meant someone was about to be the punchline. What if we brought someone unexpected? Spice things up a little? What are you suggesting? Valerio said. It wasn't really a question. Carmine turned in his chair, and Serafina felt his eyes find her before she heard him speak. Her, he said. The maid. Serafina, right? We bring her to the Christmas gala. See how long before the Beaumont Foundation crowd eats her alive. He was already laughing before he finished the sentence. My money's on 15 minutes before she's hiding in the bathroom. The table erupted. Not everyone. Senator Hargrove looked vaguely uncomfortable. Don Nico's expression didn't change, and two of the older captains stared at their plates. But enough of them laughed. Enough of them thought it was funny. The sound of it filled the room and pressed against Serafina's eardrums like something physical. She kept pouring. Her hand did not shake. She was very proud of that. 20 minutes, Marco said, grinning. Give her 20. She'll at least make it past the appetizers. More laughter. Someone made a joke about Cinderella that Serafina didn't fully hear because she was very carefully thinking about nothing, filling the decanter of her mind with the same blank quiet she always used when rooms became cruel. She was good at this. She had practice. She moved to step back from the table. Serafina, Valerio's voice, flat, unreadable. She stopped, turned, met his eyes, which she rarely did, and found them already on her, not with the dismissive non-look she usually received from the men in this room, but with something more precise than that. He was actually looking at her. She couldn't tell if that was better or worse. Yes, sir. Did you hear what was suggested? Again, not a question. Yes, sir. Something moved across his face, too fast to read. The Christmas Eve gala at the Grand Meridian. You'd accompany me and my associates. He paused. Do you have a problem with that? The room had gone quiet. 17 men watching her, some of them still smiling. Serafina held Valerio's gaze for exactly 2 seconds before she answered. I'll need to know where the donated amount is going, she said. Complete silence. I beg your pardon, Carmine said. Serafina didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on Valerio. The wager. The bets you're all placing on how quickly I'll embarrass myself. She said it plainly, the same tone she used when she told the kitchen staff they were running low on coffee. If I'm going to be the evening's entertainment, the proceeds should go somewhere that matters. Winter literacy programs. The community shelters over on Aldridge Street. They're short on funding this time of year, I've seen the announcements. The silence stretched and stretched. Carmine's mouth was open. Marco was staring at her like she'd started speaking a language he didn't recognize. Senator Hargrove had gone very still. Valerio Moretti looked at her for a long moment with an expression that, for the first time in 3 years, she couldn't categorize. Done, he said quietly. He turned back to the table as if the matter was closed. And just like that, it was. Serafina walked out of the dining hall on steady feet and made it all the way to the back corridor before she stopped walking and put her hand flat against the cold stone wall and breathed. In, out. The voices and laughter were muffled now, filtered through thick walls and distance. The corridor was dim, lit only by a string of small Christmas lights someone had wound around the crown molding. Her doing, actually, 3 days ago, when she'd helped the other staff decorate. She'd thought they looked warm, hopeful. Now they looked like a joke, she'd told herself. She pressed her forehead against the wall for a moment. The stone was cold and she was grateful for it. What had she just done? She'd spoken. That was what she'd done. In 3 years of working in this house, she had been a ghost. Intentionally, strategically, necessarily. She had built her invisibility the way you build any shelter, carefully, brick by brick, choosing survival over everything else. She hadn't complained when she was assigned the coldest wing of the estate for her quarters. She hadn't reacted when Carmine called her, "Hey, you," for the first 11 months before learning her name. She had bent and arranged herself around the sharp edges of this place until she fit without cutting herself. And then she had opened her mouth in front of 17 of the most dangerous men in the city and essentially called their joke a charity opportunity. She exhaled slowly against the stone wall. The thing was, she'd meant it. That was the part she couldn't fully process yet. She hadn't calculated it. She hadn't thought about consequences. She had simply heard Carmine's voice and felt something shift inside her chest, some plate tectonic thing moving that had been held in compression for too long, and words had come out of her mouth the way truth tends to, without permission. Survival never decided my worth. She hadn't said that part yet, but she'd thought it. She straightened up from the wall, smoothed the front of her uniform, and went back to work. Her room was in the basement level of the east wing. Not a bad room, technically. It had a window at ground level that showed a rectangle of snow and the legs of the pine trees along the estate's north fence. It had a small desk, a narrow bed, a wardrobe that she kept meticulously organized because order was one of the few things she still controlled completely. The Christmas music from the main floors filtered down through the ceiling, faint and tinny, like something heard through water. She sat on the edge of her bed at 11:47 p.m. with her hands in her lap and looked at the wardrobe. The gala was in 6 days. She hadn't opened that wardrobe's left side in a long time. When she finally crossed the room and pulled the left door open, the smell hit her first. Cedar from the drawer sachets, something faintly floral, and beneath that, the specific smell of a life she had packed away and stopped thinking about. Her fingers found the garment bag before her eyes did. It was hanging at the back, behind her work uniforms and her 2 good blouses, behind the gray wool coat she wore on her days off. She unzipped the bag slowly. The emerald velvet caught the room's dim light and threw it back richer, deeper, the color of dark forest and buried things. She'd bought this dress 4 years ago for a department fundraiser she'd been planning to attend with a friend named Cora, who she no longer spoke to, because Cora had been part of a life that existed before the hospital bills and her mother's illness, and the specific variety of exhaustion that comes from watching someone you love disappear by degrees. She'd bought the dress because Cora had dared her to, because it cost more than she should have spent, because she'd stood in the fitting room and felt, for approximately 7 minutes, like someone whose future was still open. Then her mother's diagnosis had come through, and the fundraiser had passed, and the dress had gone into the garment bag, and Serafina had come here. She touched the velvet with 2 fingers. The texture was exactly as she remembered. She didn't take it out. Not yet. She just stood there in the basement room with the distant Christmas music coming through the ceiling and her hand on emerald velvet, and something complicated moving through her that she didn't have a clean name for. She closed the wardrobe, turned off the light, lay down on top of the covers in the dark and stared at the ceiling and listened to the snow. She was 32 years old. She had a degree she wasn't using. She had a mother who was gone now, 2 years dead, the bills from which had taken everything and left her here. She had 4 years of university where she had studied art history and literature with the specific joy of someone who had found exactly the right room and wanted to stay forever. And then the world had handed her a different kind of room entirely and said, adapt. She had adapted. She was very good at adapting. But lying here in the dark on Christmas night, with her hand still half reaching in the direction of a garment bag she could no longer see, she felt, clearly, for the first time in a long time, the weight of how much adapting had cost her. She'd become invisible to survive. The question was whether she could survive becoming visible again. The next morning, the estate was quiet, in the particular way of houses after celebration, something heavy and stale in the air, the aftermath of performance. Empty glasses waited on silver trays. The Christmas decorations looked slightly less magical in daylight. Staff moved quickly and spoke in low voices, the way everyone did the morning after the captains had gathered, when the estate needed to return to normal before anyone looked too closely at what normal actually meant. Serafina was in the east corridor at 6:45 a.m., finishing the morning's first round of tasks, when she heard footsteps behind her. She recognized the weight of them before she turned. Valerio Moretti walked like a man who had never in his life needed to announce himself. She turned and straightened. Mr. Moretti. He stopped a few feet away. He was in a dark sweater and slacks, no jacket. She'd never seen him this informally dressed in the estate's public areas. He had a coffee cup in one hand, and he was looking at her with the same precise attention he'd turned on her the night before. "You sleep," he said. She waited, unsure what he meant. "Last night, you slept." I walked this corridor at 2 a.m. and your light wasn't on. Something small and cold moved through her. He'd walked this corridor at 2 in the morning. She didn't know what to do with that information. I slept, she confirmed. The gala, he said. I want to make sure you understand what it is. I've heard you describe it before, sir. You've hosted it 4 years running. Hearing me describe it at this table and attending it are different things. He looked at her steadily. The people in that room are not kind. They're not kind to each other, and they're especially not kind to anyone they perceive as, he paused, something working behind his eyes, outside their world. I understand. I'm not sure you do. Mr. Moretti. She met his eyes. I've been working in this house for 3 years. I've served dinner to men who've done things I can't unhear and pretended not to hear them. I'm fairly certain I can manage a ballroom. The silence that followed was very specific. He was looking at her the way you look at something you thought you understood and are now revising. Carmine will push back, he said finally. I know. He'll try to embarrass you publicly. I know that too. Valerio was quiet for a moment. He looked down at his coffee cup, then back at her. Why did you say yes? The question caught her differently than she expected. She'd been ready for logistics, for conditions, for the performance of authority. She hadn't been ready for curiosity. Because I was tired, she said, and heard, as she said it, that it was true. Because I've been invisible for a long time, and I wanted to see what happened if I wasn't. He didn't respond immediately. He turned the coffee cup in his hand once, twice. The donations, he said. Aldridge Street shelters, the literacy programs. I'll have it arranged. Thank you. Don't thank me. I agreed to the terms. He started to turn away, then stopped. There was a pause. Not hesitation exactly, but something adjacent to it. There's a bookshop on Carver Street, 4th Estate. They run a winter reading program for neighborhood kids during the break. He didn't look at her when he said it. They're also underfunded. I'll include them. He walked away before she could say anything. She stood in the corridor for a moment after his footsteps faded. Then she went back to work. But something had changed in the space of that conversation. Something small and precise as a hairline fracture that she wouldn't fully understand for days. The week before Christmas Eve moved the way time moves when something is coming that you cannot decide whether to fear or want. Serafina worked her shifts. She cleaned rooms, managed the kitchen's supply orders, handled the lower staff's scheduling when the head of house was managing the decorators. She did the work she'd always done, the way she'd always done it. She was good at this work. She had never been ashamed of it. Shame had never been the problem. But something was different now, and the other staff could feel it. Maria, who worked the West Wing and had been at the estate 7 years, stopped her in the kitchen on the 3rd day. Maria was 50-something, Cuban-born, with the bearing of someone who had outlasted 3 different versions of this house's management. What did you do? Maria said. Not an accusation, a genuine question. Nothing yet, Serafina said. Something. The energy's different. Maria looked at her carefully. Carmine was asking about you this morning. What kind of asking? The kind where he's trying to seem like he doesn't care, but he does. Maria put a hand briefly on Serafina's arm. You watch yourself, mija. I always do. You watched yourself invisible, Maria said. That's different from watching yourself visible. She released her arm and went back to what she'd been doing, and Serafina stood in the kitchen holding the thought. You watched yourself invisible. That's different from watching yourself visible. That night, she took the dress out of the garment bag for the first time. She held it against herself in front of the small mirror on the back of her wardrobe door and looked at her own reflection. The woman looking back at her was someone she recognized and also wasn't. The face familiar, the bearing older than she remembered, the eyes carrying 3 years of careful blankness that hadn't fully cleared yet. She thought about her mother, who had loved Christmas in the specific way of someone who understood that hope required maintenance, who had put up decorations even in the bad years. Every year a bad year, eventually, but her mother had hung the ornaments anyway, had made the apartment smell like cinnamon and oranges, had said, you celebrate because that's how you remember what you're fighting for. Serafina hadn't decorated her room this year. She'd helped decorate the rest of the estate, but not her room. She set the dress on the bed and went to the small supply closet at the end of the corridor where leftover decorations were stored. She came back with a string of lights. 3 days before Christmas Eve, she ran into Valerio in the library. This was unusual. The library was her assigned space that morning, dusting, restocking, making sure the room was maintained. She'd never encountered him here before. He was standing at the window with a book open in his hand, not reading it, watching snow fall on the garden. She said nothing. Went about her work. He said nothing either, for a long time. Art history, he said finally, without turning from the window. She looked at him. Maria told you, she said. Maria didn't tell me anything. I looked at your employment file. A pause. University of Alderton. 4 years. You left a semester before finishing your thesis. She went back to straightening shelves. That's correct. What was your thesis on? She thought about not answering, then, the use of domestic labor as subject versus background in 19th century European portraiture. The ways working women were rendered invisible through painterly convention even when they occupied the physical center of a canvas. The silence had a different quality now. Say that again, Valerio said. She turned. He was looking at her chien, fully, directly, none of the peripheral attention she usually received. Workers placed at the center of a painting, made to disappear anyway, through technique, through the artist's choices about what the eye should follow. You're talking about yourself. I'm talking about women who lived 150 years ago. You're also talking about yourself. She didn't deny it. He looked down at the book in his hand as if he'd forgotten it was there. He closed it and set it on the nearest shelf without looking at the spine. Why didn't you finish the degree? My mother got sick. And after. There was no money after, and then there was. She gestured at the room, at the estate, at everything implied. This. And the gala, he said quietly. You're using it. I'm using it to be seen, yes, she said. Isn't that what you're all doing in that ballroom? Using it? He looked at her for a moment. Yes, he said simply. It was the first fully honest thing she could remember him saying to her, and it landed with a weight she wasn't expecting. She turned back to the shelves. He left the library without another word, but the air in the room felt different after he was gone. She stood alone among the books with her hand resting on a shelf, the snow falling outside, the Christmas lights she'd strung through the library's crown molding glowing faintly in the morning light. She thought about visibility, about what it cost, about what invisibility had already taken. 2 nights before Christmas Eve, she overheard Carmine. She was in the service corridor adjacent to the smoking room, her regular route, not a detour, not eavesdropping, when his voice came through the gap under the door, loud and deliberate enough that she knew immediately he wasn't concerned about being overheard. Gonna fall apart the second a real person looks at her sideways. You wait. 20 minutes at the Meridian, and she's going to remember exactly what she is. Laughter. Marco's voice. And if she doesn't? Then we make sure she does. A pause. I'll have someone make a comment, just loud enough. These things have a way of correcting themselves. She stood in the service corridor and felt the information settle into her the way cold settles into a room when a window is opened, thoroughly, inevitably, finding every corner. She kept walking. But for the rest of that shift, something was different in her chest. Not fear exactly. Something older and harder than fear. Something that had been building for 3 years and maybe longer. The specific pressure of knowing that a room full of powerful people have decided who you are, and they're wrong, and the wrongness has been sitting inside your ribcage, compressing itself tighter every day until it becomes something almost geological. That night, in her room with the Christmas lights on, she sat at her small desk and opened the drawer where she kept a notebook she'd had for 4 years. Most of its pages were blank. She'd started writing in it and stopped multiple times. The handwriting inside was uneven, confident bursts followed by crossed-out lines, starts and stops, evidence of trying. She opened to a clean page. She wrote, I am not what this room decided I was. Then she wrote, I'm going to walk into that ballroom, and I'm going to be completely myself, and I'm going to be extraordinary. Not because they expect me to be, but because I have been waiting to be for years. She stared at what she'd written, crossed out the second sentence, wrote instead, I have been waiting to be for years. Time to stop waiting. She closed the notebook. Outside her window, the snow fell on the estate grounds, on the pine trees wrapped in Christmas lights, on a city that had no idea she existed. Not yet. Christmas Eve arrived cold and absolute. Serafina was up before 5. She completed her morning assignments, handed off her remaining responsibilities to Maria with specific instructions, and was back in her room by 2 in the afternoon with enough time to do the work that mattered. She took the dress from the hanger. She sat at her small mirror for 45 minutes and did what she needed to do with care and without rush. She wasn't trying to look like someone else. She was trying to look like herself, the version of herself that had existed before survival required her to shrink. When she was ready, she looked in the mirror. The emerald velvet caught the light. Her back was straight. Her face was her own. She picked up her coat, turned off the Christmas lights in her room, and left. She walked through the estate's service entrance and down the corridor toward the main foyer, where Valerio's car would be waiting with the others. She heard the voices before she turned the corner. Carmine, Marco, 2 others, the pre-event ritual noise of men preparing for an evening they thought they controlled. She turned the corner. The voices stopped. Carmine recovered first. She could see him working to assemble something dismissive, some joke that would restore the order he'd decided on. But the joke didn't come, because Valerio had turned from the window where he'd been standing, and whatever expression crossed his face in the half-second before he controlled it was enough to scatter Carmine's confidence before it could form. Nobody said anything for a long moment. "We're going to be late," Serafina said calmly. She walked past them toward the door. Outside, the snow was falling. The city glowed in the middle distance. And somewhere across that city, a ballroom full of people who had already decided who they were and who everyone else was waited for a Christmas Eve that was about to become something none of them expected. She got in the car, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt the specific sensation of a woman arriving, not surviving, not enduring, not shrinking, but arriving in full to something that had been waiting for her. The car moved through the snow toward the meridian. Carmine was silent the whole drive. Valerio looked out the window. But once, just once, he looked at her instead, and she saw in his eyes something she hadn't expected to find in the eyes of a man like him, something that looked, if she wasn't completely wrong, like recognition. The car pulled up to the Grand Meridian, and through the windows, Serafina could see the ballroom blazing with light, the silhouettes of the city's most powerful people moving behind glass like figures in a snow globe. And in her coat pocket, her hand closed briefly around the small notebook she'd brought. Not to read from, just to remember what she'd written. "I have been waiting to be for years. Time to stop waiting." The door opened. The snow fell. She stepped out. The Grand Meridian's entrance was the kind of architectural statement that existed solely to remind you of your place in the world. 12 stone steps led up from the street, each one wide enough to land a small plane on. Iron railings wrapped in pine garland and white lights ran along both sides. 2 doormen in black wool coats stood at the top with the practiced stillness of men paid to look like they weren't watching everything. Above the entrance, the Meridian's name was carved into limestone in letters 2 feet tall, and above that, 6 stories of lit windows threw warm gold light into the falling snow like the building was on fire from the inside. Serafina stood on the sidewalk and looked up at it. She'd walked past this building before. On days off, running errands, moving through the city the way people without cars and without time move through cities, quickly, practically, without looking up. She knew the Meridian's exterior the way you know the exterior of any building that has never been for you. Familiarly, distantly. Standing at its base in emerald velvet with snow melting in her hair was a different category of experience. "Move up the steps," Carmine said behind her, low and tight. "You're blocking the valet." She moved up the steps. The doorman registered her the way doormen at places like this registered anything unexpected. A half-second of recalibration before the professional mask reasserted itself. One of them pulled the door open. She walked through into a wall of warm air and orchestral music and the collective scent of wealth, which had its own specific character. Cedar and expensive florals and something underlaid that was less pleasant. The smell of rooms where nobody ever had to apologize for anything. The Grand Meridian's main hall was 40 feet high and paneled in pale marble. A Christmas tree stood at the center of it, like a monument, 12 feet of blue spruce decorated entirely in white and gold, with lights that pulsed very slowly, almost like breathing. The marble floor was polished to a mirror finish. Above, a chandelier the size of a small house spread its branches across the ceiling, and beneath it, 163 people moved through the space in black tie and jewels, talking, laughing, conducting the social performance of people who had never once in their lives worried about the electric bill. Serafina counted the exits in the time it took her to cross the threshold. Old habit. Learned from 3 years in a house where knowing where the doors were was just practical. 4 exits visible from this angle. Service corridor at the far left, 2 emergency doors flanking the main ballroom entrance. The way she'd come in. She filed that and kept walking. Behind her, Valerio had stopped just inside the entrance. She could feel the room's energy shift around him, the way energy shifts around anyone who has enough power. People angling slightly in his direction without fully turning, conversations adjusted, the social ecosystem reorganizing around his presence, the way weather reorganizes around pressure systems. He was the weather in every room he entered. Tonight, she was going to be something else. She wasn't sure yet what, but something. Valerio. The voice came from the right, a tall man in his 60s with silver hair and a red pocket square, moving through the crowd with the practiced ease of someone who owns several things in this building. Thomas Harfield. She recognized him from the newspapers. Head of the Beaumont Foundation, the organization technically hosting tonight's event. You look like a man attending his own execution. Harfield, Valerio said. They shook hands. Who did you bring? Harfield's eyes had already found her. Not unkindly, more with the assessment of someone cataloging newcomers. I don't think we've been introduced. Valerio opened his mouth. Serafina Vale, she said, and extended her hand to Harfield before Valerio could say anything else. I'm glad to be here. I followed the Foundation's literacy work in the Alderton neighborhood, the after-school reading program. 3rd year running, isn't it? Harfield blinked. Then something in his face relaxed into genuine interest. 4th, actually. You know the program? I know the neighborhood, she said. I grew up 3 blocks from the Alderton Community Center. Those programs matter. Something shifted in his eyes. The transition from polite social attention to actual attention. He shook her hand. Thomas Harfield. And you are absolutely right that they matter. Far more than most people in this room understand. He glanced at Valerio with a slight dryness. You'll have to tell me where Valerio found someone worth talking to. She found herself, Valerio said quietly. Harfield raised an eyebrow. Well, he offered Serafina a brief nod. I hope we have a chance to talk more tonight, Ms. Vale. My colleague runs the Alderton program. She'd want to speak with you. He moved off into the crowd. Serafina turned slightly to continue into the ballroom. Carmine was beside her in 3 steps. Close enough that it wasn't accidental. Impressive, he said under his breath. Memorize some talking points. I lived it, she said, and kept walking. She heard him exhale through his nose. Sharp, controlled. The sound of a man recalibrating. She didn't look back. The ballroom itself was through a set of double doors 20 feet high, and when they opened it hit you. The full scope of it, the music louder now, a string quartet in the far corner playing something she recognized as Elgar, though most of the room probably registered it only as elegant background, the Christmas trees at each corner of the space wrapped in ribbons of copper and gold, the long windows showing the city and the snow beyond, and the people, packed but not crushed, moving in the specific social choreography of events like this, where every conversation was also an audition and every introduction was also a transaction. Serafina walked in and felt the room the way she'd learned to feel every room in the estate. Not with nervousness, but with attention. The attention of someone who has spent years watching how rooms work from their edges and is now standing at the center. She knew these people. Not personally, but she knew their type with an intimacy that none of them would have guessed. She'd cleaned their glasses. She'd listened to their conversations without being seen. She'd watched what they revealed when they forgot the maid was in the room. She moved toward the room's east side where she could see a cluster of people gathered around a temporary exhibition. Framed photographs, large format, black and white, of winter neighborhoods from around the city. Community shots, families, street vendors, kids in snow. She recognized the subject matter immediately. This was documentation of the neighborhoods whose residents the foundation was supposedly here to support. She stood in front of a photograph for a moment. A woman pushing a cart through snow, 2 kids behind her. The woman's face was turned slightly away from the camera, but her posture told everything. Forward-leaning, effortful, moving. "Beautiful work," said a voice beside her. A woman in her late 40s, natural gray in her hair, wearing a suit instead of a gown. The only one Serafina had seen in a suit. The woman was looking at the photograph with an expression that suggested she'd taken it or knew the person who had. "Who's the photographer?" Serafina asked. "My daughter," the woman said. "She spent 3 weeks in those neighborhoods last January. Not to document poverty, to document resilience." She turned and held out her hand. "Delia Marsh, I run the Alderton program Thomas was probably just telling you about." Serafina felt something unexpected. The specific sensation of a conversation that was real in a room full of performed ones. "Serafina Vale, I grew up 3 blocks from Alderton." Delia Marsh's expression changed. Not with surprise, exactly, with the quality of someone who recognized a thing they'd been looking for. "Then I have questions," she said simply. "If you're willing." "I'm willing," Serafina said. They talked for 14 minutes. Serafina knew this because she was aware peripherally of Carmine's position in the room, shifting twice as he recalibrated where she was. She talked to Delia Marsh about the Alderton neighborhood's actual needs, as opposed to the Foundation's assumptions about those needs. She talked about the families she'd grown up watching, the ones who used the library until the library cut its hours, the ones who disappeared from school because the school's after-hours tutoring required a parent to pick up, which required a parent to not be working a second shift. She talked about the gap between programming that looked good in reports and programming that actually worked. Delia Marsh listened the way good people listen, without planning her next response, without looking over Serafina's shoulder. "You should be at the planning table," Marsh said finally. "I wasn't invited to the planning table," Serafina said. "I'm inviting you now." Marsh produced a card. "January. We're doing a program restructure. I want people in the room who know this from the inside." She pressed the card into Serafina's hand. "Don't lose that." Serafina looked at the card. She closed her hand around it. Carmine found her 23 minutes into the gala. She'd moved to the drink station. Sparkling water, she'd decided. Nothing that would blur the edges of anything tonight. And was turning back toward the room when he materialized at her elbow with the deliberate arrival of a man who had been building toward something. "Having fun?" He smiled the smile that meant the opposite. "Productive evening," she said. "Marsh," he said. The name dropped out of his mouth with contempt. "Foundation people. Nice enough, but they don't matter. The real conversations are over there." He gestured toward a cluster of men near the north windows. She recognized 2 city council members, a real estate developer named Bianchi she'd heard referenced at the estate, and Don Nico standing very still at the edge of the group the way Don Nico always stood, like a piece of furniture that was also a threat. That's where decisions get made. "Some decisions," she said. "All the ones that matter." "I was just offered a seat at a planning table that affects 3,000 kids in Alderton," she said. "Does that not matter?" Something moved behind his eyes. She watched him process the information, locate the threat in it, calculate his response. "You're cute," he said. "You think one conversation means something. I think 17 conversations mean something, which is how many I've had tonight." That wasn't quite true. She'd had 9 meaningful ones, and the rest had been the usual social surface. But she said it evenly and watched the number land. His smile got smaller and more precise. "Let me tell you what's going to happen. You're going to have a lovely evening. You're going to go home feeling very good about yourself. And then next week you're going to be exactly where you were, bringing wine to men who don't remember your name." He leaned slightly toward her. "That's not cruelty. That's just how the world works." She looked at him for a long moment. "What's your mother's name?" she asked. He blinked. "What? Your mother? What was her name?" The non sequitur had cracked his rhythm. She could see it. The slight delay before he reassembled. "What the hell does that have to do with—" "Mine was Constance," Serafina said. She cleaned offices. 40 hours a week for 19 years. She knew every person's name in the buildings she worked in. None of them knew hers. She picked up her glass. "I'm just curious whether you see a problem with that or whether you only notice things that happen to people who look like you." She walked away from him before he could answer. She heard him exhale behind her, something between a laugh and a breath forced out under pressure. And then nothing. which was worse for him than a response would have been. She was standing near the east windows watching snow when Marco found her. This felt different from Carmine. Marco was younger, 30, maybe 31, with the wiry restlessness of someone who hadn't yet settled into his position the way Carmine had. He had a drink in his hand, and he'd clearly had 2 or 3 before this one. He stopped beside her and looked out at the snow without preamble. "Carmine's angry," he said. "I noticed. He's going to do something before the end of tonight." She looked at him sideways. "Are you warning me?" Marco turned the glass in his hand. His jaw worked for a moment. "I'm telling you a fact. What you do with it is your business." "Why tell me at all?" A pause. He looked out at the snow. "I have a sister," he said. "She cleans offices, 40 hours a week." He let the sentence sit there without elaboration. Serafina was quiet for a moment. "Constance," she said half to herself. "What?" "Nothing." She turned to face the room. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. We're not friends." But he moved away from her with slightly less aggression than he'd arrived with, which she counted as something. She found Valerio across the room. He was standing near the main Christmas tree with Senator Hargrove, nodding at something Hargrove was saying with the specific quality of attention that meant he wasn't actually listening. His eyes were moving. She recognized it now. The scan, the assessment, the constant maintenance of situational awareness that she imagined came with being the kind of man he was. He was tracking the room's dynamics the way she tracked rooms. His eyes found her. She didn't look away. Neither did he. Something happened in that held contact. Not dramatic, nothing she could have described with full precision, but something that had the quality of 2 people recognizing a shared competency. Then Hargrove said something that required a response, and Valerio looked away. Serafina exhaled slowly. She went back to working the room. At the 9:45 mark, things started moving. She felt it before she saw it. That particular shift in the quality of nearby conversations, the way attention gathered and redirected when something was about to happen. She was midway through a conversation with Delia Marsh's colleague, a young man named Prescott, who managed the literacy program's Eastern District operations, when she caught the movement in her peripheral vision. Carmine, moving through the crowd with purpose, toward her, not alone. Beside him was a woman she didn't recognize, 50s, expensively dressed, the practiced composure of someone who'd been attending events like this for 3 decades. The woman's expression had a specific set to it that Serafina recognized from a different context, the look of someone who'd been told a story and was there to deliver the ending. She finished her sentence to Prescott, turned. They were 6 feet away. "Serafina," Carmine said her name with the over-precise diction of someone performing casualness. "I don't think you've met Patricia Aldis. She chairs the Beaumont Foundation's South District Committee." Patricia Aldis looked at her with the cool assessment of a woman who had been very carefully briefed. "You work on the Moretti estate," Aldis said. Not a question. "I did," Serafina said. "Household staff." Another non-question. "Housekeeping, yes. And Mr. Moretti brought you to the gala this year." Aldis's voice was precise and light, the kind of voice that could deliver an insult at a frequency only certain people could hear. "That's quite an..." She paused. "Unusual invitation." Around them, conversations were softening. Not stopping, but thinning, the way nearby sounds get quieter when people are listening to something specific without wanting to appear to. Serafina felt the architecture of the moment. Carmine had engineered this. He'd found someone to deliver a public challenge wearing the costume of polite social curiosity. If Serafina deflected, she looked ashamed. If she reacted with anger, she looked unstable. If she tried to explain herself, she'd already lost. He'd thought about it. She'd give him that. "Unusual," she repeated and let the words sit for a moment. "Mr. Moretti and I had an agreement about tonight. The terms included charitable donations to programs that serve neighborhoods most people in this room only visit in photographs." She glanced at the exhibition behind them, which is an interesting thing, if you think about it. We photograph resilience and hang it on walls to admire it, while the people inside those photographs struggle to fund the next year's rent. Aldis's expression didn't shift. "That's a very..." "Patricia." Delia Marsh was there, a appearing at Serafina's shoulder with the timing of someone who'd also been watching the room. Have you spoken to Serafina about the Alderton restructure? I've asked her to come in January. She has ground-level insight our planning process has been missing. A beat of silence. Aldous looked between them. No, I hadn't heard. January 15th, Marsh said firmly. I'd value your input too if you can manage it. She looked at Carmine with the politely dismissive attention of someone who had placed him in a category and found it uninteresting. I don't think we've met. Carmine said his name. Marsh looked at him blankly. And your connection to the Foundation's work? I'm with Valerio Moretti's organization, Marsh said. Yes, the Moretti organization makes a substantial annual donation. We're grateful. She turned back to Serafina as though the conversation were already finished. Come find me before 10. I want to introduce you to 2 more people before the evening ends. She walked away. Serafina looked at Carmine. His jaw was tight. His drink was empty. He was working to keep his face composed, and he was doing it badly. She's going to be in January, he said quietly, for her ears only. You won't. We'll see, she said. She left him standing there. She found a moment of quiet on the terrace at 10:15. The doors to the terrace were technically closed for the winter, but the latch was loose. She'd noticed it on the way in, and she slipped through into the cold air and the snow. The terrace looked out over the city's central district, buildings lit against the dark sky, snow falling with the particular density that meant accumulation. She could see the Alderton neighborhood from here, or at least the direction of it. The lower, darker section of the city's skyline where the buildings weren't quite as tall and the lights weren't quite as bright. She stood there and let the cold work on her for a moment. Her hands were shaking slightly. Not from cold. She pressed them flat against the stone railing and breathed. The air tasted like winter and car exhaust, and the specific ozone quality of heavy snowfall, and it was the realest thing she'd experienced all evening. Everything inside had been performance and electricity and the near-constant management of being looked at by people who'd been told a story about her. Out here was just snow and city and her own heartbeat. She counted her breaths. 4 in. Hold for 4. 4 out. Her mother had taught her that. Constance Vale's anxiety management system passed down the way practical things get passed down. Not as instruction, but as observation. Watching her mother do it in the car before difficult appointments, in the hallway before hard conversations. Her mother, who had cleaned offices for 19 years. Her mother, who had never once, in all those years, pretended to be less than she was. Who had just been exactly herself, all the time, and paid for it in the specific way invisible people pay, which is the absence of return. Serafina breathed. Behind her, the terrace door opened. She turned. Valerio stepped out into the cold without a coat, which struck her as a very specific kind of stubbornness, and pulled the door closed behind him. He stood a few feet away and looked at the city without saying anything for a moment. Carmine's inside telling people you're having a breakdown, he said. That's creative of him, she said. He's also telling people you're an imposter, that you researched the Foundation's programs specifically to appear qualified. He paused. He got there in the last 20 minutes. And what are you doing out here instead of managing that? He was quiet for a moment. I'm not sure, he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the city, his breath visible in the cold air, his expression doing the thing it did where it was completely controlled, and also, if you knew how to look, absolutely not. You let this happen, she said. He turned. What? The wager. The gala. You let Carmine make it because you weren't paying attention, and then you agreed because agreeing was easier than redirecting 20 men who found the idea amusing. She watched his face. You didn't set out to humiliate me, but you also didn't set out not to. And that's its own category of failure. The silence had a specific texture. Yes, he said. She hadn't expected that, the directness of it, the absence of defense. You keep doing that, she said. What? Agreeing with things you could deflect. Deflecting takes energy I don't have for things that are just... He paused. True. Snow fell between them. The city hummed below. Somewhere inside, the string quartet had moved into something quieter, and it filtered through the glass as a murmur. I'm leaving after the holidays, she said. She'd decided it in the last 40 minutes, somewhere between Marsh handing her the card and Carmine's face when his maneuver hadn't worked. She'd decided it the way you decide things that have actually been decided for a long time, and you're only just catching up to. I'm going back to finish the degree. He looked at her. The thesis, she said. The invisible women in the center of the painting. I want to finish it. She watched something move through his face. Not one thing, several things, in quick succession, and then the controlled stillness reasserted itself and she lost the thread of what she'd seen. The bookshop, he said. Fourth Estate, on Carver Street. What about it? The owner. Her name is Renata. She and I... He stopped, started again. She used to run literacy circles there, years ago, before the neighborhood changed and the funding dried up. She has a room full of materials she can't afford to distribute. He was speaking carefully now, the way people speak when they're handing something over that they haven't handed over before. I've been paying her rent, the building's lease, for 3 years. He looked at the city. No one knows. She stared at him. Why are you telling me that? She said. Because you said you were leaving. A pause. Because I wanted someone to know it before you did. The snowfall was heavier now. Below them, the city moved in its Christmas Eve rhythm, cabs and pedestrians and the soft machinery of a night that most people would remember as festive and uncomplicated. Serafina stood in the cold on the terrace of the Grand Meridian and felt the shape of the moment shift under her light ground that isn't quite as solid as it appeared. She opened her mouth. The terrace door opened behind them with a crack. Carmine. Not alone. Marco behind him, and behind Marco, 2 men she recognized from the estate's outer security. His face had moved past the controlled anger of earlier into something raw, the expression of a man who had run out of indirect options. We have a problem, he said, and he wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Valerio. Ferraro, he said. The kid from the East Docks. He talked. The name landed in the cold air and sat there. She watched Valerio's face go completely, immediately still. Not the usual controlled stillness, but something beneath it, the stillness of a man processing information that changes the shape of everything around it. Talk to who? Valerio said. Federal. Someone in your operation moved too fast, and the Ferraro kid was the thread, and now... Carmine stopped. His eyes moved to Serafina with a quality she recognized from 3 years of watching men decide whether she mattered. She needs to not be here for this. Valerio didn't move. Valerio, Carmine's voice dropped. This is not a conversation for... She stays, Valerio said. The silence was total. Carmine stared at him. You've lost your... She stays, Valerio repeated quietly, with the specific quality of finality. And in the snowfall on the terrace above Christmas Eve, and a city that was about to change in ways none of them fully understood yet, Serafina felt the ground shift completely beneath everything. Because Carmine was right about one thing. This was not a conversation for her, and Valerio had kept her in it anyway, which meant something she wasn't entirely sure either of them was ready for. She didn't move, neither did Valerio. The snow fell between them all, indifferent and exact, while below the city hummed and glittered and the string quartet played on through the glass. And the thing that had been building since the night Serafina Vale had opened her mouth in a dining room full of dangerous men, finally, irrevocably, tipped over. That was the word that came to Serafina later, when she had time and distance enough to think about it. The way a glass tips, the moment before the fall when the physics are already decided and the only thing left is the landing. Everything on that terrace had already tipped. She just didn't know it yet. Carmine was still staring at Valerio with the expression of a man who had just watched something he considered fundamental get violated in front of him. Marco had stepped back half a pace, unconscious probably, the body's instinct to create distance from an explosion in progress. The 2 security men flanking the doorway had gone to the specific quality of stillness that meant they were waiting for instruction and would follow whatever came without question. The snow fell on all of them equally. The Ferraro kid talked to federal investigators, Valerio said, and his voice was the same it always was, flat, even, giving nothing. But Serafina had been in rooms with him for 3 years, and she heard something beneath the evenness that she'd never heard before. A hairline thing, something load-bearing that had just been asked to carry more weight than it was designed for. When? Tonight, Carmine said. Hour ago. Got the call from Benedetti. He has a contact at the field office. They're moving on the dock operation by morning. The dock operation is clean, Valerio said. The dock operation has Ferraro's name on 6 invoices that tie back to the Alderton warehouse. Carmine paused. Which has your name on the lease. The silence that followed was not like other silences. It had density to it. Weight. Serafina stood completely still. She was doing the thing she'd spent 3 years doing. The practiced absence, the blank presence. But this time it wasn't performance. She had gone genuinely, instinctively still, the way animals go still when something large is moving nearby. The Alderton warehouse. She turned the words over carefully in her mind. Alderton. The neighborhood she'd grown up in. 3 blocks from the community center. The same neighborhood where Fourth Estate Books operated, where Renata ran her literacy program on a lease Valerio had been quietly paying for 3 years. Something cold moved through her that had nothing to do with the outdoor temperature. What's in the Alderton warehouse? She said. Both men looked at her. Carmine's expression shifted into something she recognized. The look of a person calculating, rapidly, what it cost them that she'd just asked that question. Valerio's face was unreadable. That's not... Carmine started. What's in the Alderton warehouse? She said again, and her voice came out flat in a way she hadn't intended. The flatness of someone who has suddenly understood that the ground they've been standing on is different in composition than they believed. Valerio looked at her for a long moment. He didn't answer, and the not answering was itself an answer, complete and devastating. She looked at him, really looked. Not the practiced, peripheral, professional attention she'd given him for 3 years, but the direct look of someone who needs to read a face without any interference. What she found there was not guilt exactly. It was something more complicated than guilt. Something that looked, if she was reading it correctly, like a man who has been carrying a weight for so long he'd stopped being able to feel its shape. The bookshop, she said slowly. Renata's literacy program. The rent you've been paying. She felt the pieces assembling themselves with the horrible efficiency of a thing that was always true and is only now becoming visible. The money, where does it come from? Marco made a sound in his throat. We should take this inside. Where does it come from? She said, not loudly, but with a precision that cut through the cold air and Marco's objection with equal efficiency. Valerio held her gaze. The Alderton operation generates... Stop. She said it before he finished the sentence. She needed 1 second. 1 second to hold the door closed before what was on the other side of it came through. She pressed her hands flat against the terrace railing behind her. The stone was very cold. She focused on that. The cold, the specific texture of wet stone under her palms, the weight of the snow that was still falling on her bare shoulders, on her emerald dress, on the city below that was going about its Christmas Eve in complete ignorance of what was happening on this terrace. Then she released the breath she'd been holding. The literacy programs, she said. The community shelters. The bookshop. The after-school programs in Alderton. She heard her own voice as if from a slight distance. They're funded with money from whatever's in that warehouse. Nobody denied it. The snow fell. Somewhere inside the meridian, the string quartet had moved into something that sounded almost cheerful. Cha-cha. She pushed past Carmine to get inside. He reached for her arm, reflex, she thought, the instinct to contain, and she stopped and looked at his hand on her arm with an expression that must have communicated something definitive because he released it immediately. The ballroom hit her like a physical object. Warm air, light, music, the noise of 163 people having a holiday party. She walked through it and felt none of it. She was moving on the motor functions of a person in a particular state of shock, not the collapse kind, but the forward kind, the kind where your body keeps operating because it doesn't know what else to do, and your mind is somewhere behind you trying to catch up. She found the coat room, gave the attendant her ticket, waited the 40 seconds it took to retrieve her coat, put it on, buttoned it. Her hands worked fine. That was the strange part. Her hands were completely steady. She was at the Meridian side exit when she heard his footsteps. Serafina. She kept walking. Through the door, into the cold, down the side steps to the street. Snow hit her face immediately. Not gentle now, thicker, with intention. Serafina. Closer. She stopped. Not because she wanted to, because she'd spent 3 years building a self-control that was now operating independently of what she wanted, and her self-control apparently had opinions about running from things. She turned. Valerio was on the steps behind her, still without a coat. She noted this with the detached part of her mind that kept noticing things even when everything else was in chaos. His breath coming in visible clouds in the cold air. He looked at her with the expression he'd worn on the terrace, the complicated one. "Let me explain," he said. "I have a working understanding of how it functions," she said. "I've been in your house for 3 years. I'm not naive. Then you understand it's more complicated than, I understand that I told Delia Marsh tonight that she should trust the Moretti organization's contributions because the man behind them had changed." She heard the words as she said them and felt them in a completely different part of her body than where speech usually registers, somewhere lower, where the kind of nausea lives that has nothing to do with the stomach. "I said that, tonight, in that room." "You didn't say—" "I implied it," she said. "I stood there with Delia Marsh and Thomas Harfield and people who have spent years trying to do something real in neighborhoods that have been swallowed by operations like yours, and I was the proof of concept. I was the evidence that you were something different than what you are." She stopped, breathed. "I didn't know I was doing that, but they didn't know that either." The snow came down between them. Valerio was quiet for a long moment. His jaw was tight. His hands were at his sides, and he was doing the thing with his right hand, completely still, the position she'd learned to recognize as actually dangerous. But she didn't think the danger was directed at her. She thought it might be directed at himself. "The warehouse," he said finally, "is not what Carmine described." "Then what is it?" "It's complicated." "You keep using that word." "Because it is." He came down 2 steps. Still above her, but closer. "The Alderton location. What moves through it, what I know about it, it's not clean. I know that. I've known it for years." His voice had a quality she'd never heard from him in 3 years. Something stripped of the performance of authority. Something that was just the raw sound of a man stating a fact he hated. But what comes out of it, the money that goes to the bookshop, the shelters, the programs, that's real. That part is real. You can't launder harm into good, she said. It doesn't work like that. I know. The kids in Alderton reading books at Fourth Estate, they don't know what funded the roof they're under. I know. Renata doesn't know. No. Delia Marsh doesn't know. No. His voice had gone very quiet. She looked at him. The snow was in his hair. He hadn't moved to brush it away. He was standing in the cold in a tailored jacket, and he looked, for the first time in the entire 3 years she'd known him, genuinely at a loss. She didn't soften toward it. Then it's not good, she said. It's just harm wearing a different coat. She turned and walked. What? She walked for 11 blocks before she realized she had no plan. The cold was significant now. Her coat was good, but not sufficient for standing still in this temperature, and the snow had accumulated enough on the sidewalks that each step required attention. She walked anyway. She turned when she needed to turn to avoid the main streets, where Christmas Eve pedestrian traffic would require her to perform normalcy, and she found herself in the quieter sections, the residential blocks south of the Meridian, the side streets where the storefronts were dark, and the only lights were the Christmas displays in apartment windows above. She passed a window with a paper star in it, handmade, crayon yellow. A kid's work. She stopped walking. She stood on the sidewalk in the snow and looked at the paper star and felt, with a clarity that was almost clinical, the full architecture of what had just collapsed. 3 years. 3 years of building invisibility into a shelter, of telling herself that surviving this was temporary, that it was a bridge between the person she'd had to become and the person she was going to be. 3 years of watching the estate's operation from its edges and not asking questions about the parts she didn't want to understand, because not asking was itself a survival strategy. She'd been complicit in her own blindness. That was the part that made the air hard to breathe. Not Valerio's admission, not the warehouse, not even the money that funded the programs she'd praised tonight in front of people who deserved better information. All of that was terrible, but it was external terrible. It was the world being what it was, which she'd known for years. What was sitting in her chest like a stone was the understanding that she had used this evening, this gala, this dress, this reclamation she'd been building toward, to stand up in front of people like Delia Marsh and implicitly argue for the legitimacy of a man whose legitimacy she had never actually verified. She'd wanted to see him as something he might not be, and that wanting had made her careless. She started walking again, faster. She needed to be somewhere warm. She needed to think. She needed, specifically, to decide whether the Alderton warehouse changed the calculation about January and Delia Marsh's invitation and the card in her coat pocket and everything that had been offered tonight. She didn't know the answer yet. That was honest, at least. She was 6 blocks from the estate when the car pulled up beside her. She recognized it before she saw who was inside. Valerio's car, the black one, not the convoy vehicle they'd taken to the Meridian, but his personal car that she'd seen parked in the estate's east lot for 3 years. The window came down. It wasn't Valerio. It was Marco. He was driving alone, which was unusual, and he had the expression of someone who had drawn a short straw and was not pleased about it. "Get in," he said. "I'm walking. It's Christmas Eve and it's 22 degrees and you're walking in a ball gown. I have a coat. Serafina." He said her name with a flatness that was, she registered distantly, the first time he'd used it. Not hey or her or a gesture in her direction. Her name. "I'm not here for Valerio. I'm here because Maria called me and asked me to make sure you got back safe." He paused. "Maria has opinions about my soul that I'd rather not give her more ammunition about." She stood in the snow for a moment. Then she got in the car. They drove in silence for 2 blocks. "The warehouse," she said. Marco's hands adjusted on the wheel. "What about it?" "What's actually in it?" A long pause. "Marco." "Distribution," he said. "Logistics. Some of it's legitimate. Food service, building supplies, that's all real. Some of it—" He stopped. "Some of it is less clean." "How less clean?" "The kind of less clean you don't ask about if you want to sleep at night." He glanced at her in the rear view. "Which I realize doesn't help you any." "It's the honest answer," she said. "Yeah, well." He turned onto the estate's approach road. "Honest answers are expensive in this operation. What's the Ferraro situation?" He exhaled through his nose. The kid was 23. Too ambitious, not enough patience. He was moving product outside his authorization and documenting it badly, and someone in the federal task force found the documentation. A pause. He talked to reduce his exposure, which means he told them about the dock operation, which connects to the warehouse, which connects to— "Valerio," she said. "By 2 degrees, Marco said. Maybe 3, depending on how the paperwork reads." He pulled up to the estate's side entrance. "Carmine wants to make the problem go away. The Ferraro kid, specifically." She looked at him. "Make it go away?" she said carefully. Marco's jaw worked. He didn't answer, which was its own answer. She got out of the car. She stood on the estate's side steps in the snow and looked at the building in front of her. The Christmas lights still burning in the windows, the estate glowing with warmth and decoration, the same building she'd watched from the inside for 3 years, and felt it be a completely different thing than it had been this morning. She went inside. She was in her room for 40 minutes before the knock came. She'd changed out of the dress, carefully, taking the time to hang it properly, the emerald velvet back in its garment bag, with a thoroughness that she recognized as the kind of precision you apply to things when your hands need something to do. She'd put on her own clothes, made tea with the small electric kettle on her desk, sat at the desk and looked at Delia Marsh's card for a long time without touching it. The knock was quiet. 3 taps. She opened the door. Valerio. He was still in his gala jacket. His tie was gone. She wasn't sure when that had happened. He had his hands in his pockets, and he was looking at her with the expression she'd been cataloging all evening and still couldn't fully name. "The Ferraro situation," she said. She didn't step back from the door. "Carmine wants to handle it." He didn't answer immediately. "Does that mean what I think it means?" "It won't happen," he said. "That's not the same as no." "No," he said. "It won't happen. I've already told Carmine." She studied him. "Why?" Because I'm telling you it won't. That's not a reason. Because he stopped. Something moved across his face. He looked away from her, toward the window at ground level, showing snow and the pine tree legs. Because I looked at what Carmine was planning, and I looked at where it would put me in relation to... He stopped again. To what I've been building on Alderton Street, the bookshop, the programs. And I understood that I can't protect both of those things simultaneously. And I chose. She waited. I chose the programs, he said. The hall was quiet. From upstairs, faint Christmas music. Someone had left a radio on. The Ferraro kid, she said. He's 23 years old. I know. And Carmine was going to... You see, I know what Carmine was going to do. His voice was very even. And I said no, tonight. He looked at her directly. That's what I came to tell you. She held the door and looked at him and tried to find the deception in it and couldn't, which was not the same as there being no deception. She understood that. She'd been finding his complexity without finding his limits for 3 years, and she still wasn't sure where those limits were. But something about the way he was standing in her basement corridor in his gala jacket, with his tie gone and snow still damp in his hair, something about the quality of the statement, I chose the programs, landed differently than anything else he'd said tonight. The federal investigation, she said. It's coming regardless. Yes. And you're going to be in it. Probably. And Carmine. Carmine is going to do what Carmine does, he said, which means he's going to protect himself first. I have no illusions about that. Does he know you said no to the Ferraro situation? Valerio looked at her for a moment. Not yet. The implication of that sat in the corridor between them. When Carmine found out, the dynamic inside the operation would shift, quickly, dangerously, in ways that would be hard to contain. She understood enough from 3 years of peripheral exposure to know that Carmine's loyalty to Valerio was transactional, always had been. And a transaction renegotiated under pressure was a transaction that often didn't survive. You need to leave the estate, Valerio said. Not, he pressed his mouth together for a moment. Not because I want you to. Because what's coming is going to make this building unsafe. For everyone who works here, but... A pause. Especially for you, after tonight. She understood what he meant by after tonight, after the gala, after she'd stopped being invisible, after she'd become the kind of person Carmine associated with the erosion of his control. Where would I go? She said. Not helplessly, practically. I have a property on the north end, completely separate from everything operational. He stopped. I bought it 3 years ago. I've never used it. He looked at her. It's clean. Whatever comes, it won't touch that building. She stared at him. You bought a property 3 years ago, she said slowly. Yes. The same year I came to work here. His expression didn't change, but something in it concentrated. That's a coincidence, he said. And the way he said it was not quite a statement and not quite an admission, and existed in the narrow space between them where too many things had been living for too long. She put her hand on the doorframe. She was not going to let herself be reckless about this. She was not going to take the warmth of the last 3 hours and the complexity of this man and the wreckage of the evening and construct from those materials something that might not be real. I'm going to call Delia Marsh, she said, in the morning. I'm going to tell her what I know about the Alderton warehouse funding. The silence that followed was absolute. That will end the Foundation's relationship with my organization, he said. Yes. The programs lose their funding. They find different funding, she said, with clean money, which they deserve. His jaw was tight. He was breathing slowly, the measured breath of a man processing something that was costing him more than he expected to pay. You understand what that also does to you? She looked at him. Yes, I understand. He was quiet for a long moment. Okay, he said. The simplicity of it stopped her. Okay, she repeated. Make the call. He looked at the floor briefly, then back at her. It's the right thing. She searched his face for resentment and couldn't find it. What she found instead was something she recognized because she'd felt it herself. The specific exhaustion of a person who has been pretending a thing is sustainable and has finally stopped pretending. The call will implicate you, she said. I know. You could stop me. I could try, he said. I won't. She held on to the door frame. Why? She said. He held her gaze. Because some things matter more than the operation, he said. I've been saying that to myself for 3 years while never quite acting on it. A pause. You acted on it in 20 minutes inside a ballroom. She didn't have an answer for that. He turned to leave. Valerio. He stopped. She looked at him in the dim corridor with the Christmas lights strung along the crown molding. Her doing, weeks ago, a small act of hope she hadn't fully understood at the time. The North property, she said. Is it actually clean? He turned back. Yes. No operational connection? None. She considered him. I'll think about it, she said. He nodded once and walked away down the corridor. She watched until he turned the corner. Then she closed the door. She stood in the center of her room for a moment. The tea was cold. The garment bag with the emerald dress hung on the wardrobe door. Delia Marsh's card was on the desk where she'd left it. Outside the window, snow fell on the pine trees in the blue dark of Christmas Eve. She picked up the card. She set it by her phone. She would call in this morning. She had decided that. The call would do damage to the program she cared about, to Valerio's organization, to the careful architecture of tonight's small victories. And the programs would need to find a different way forward, and the operation would absorb or not absorb what came from the investigation, and all of it would be painful and necessary and real. She was making peace with that. What she was not making peace with, what was sitting in her chest refusing to be resolved, was the property on the north end. Clean money. 3 years old, the year she arrived. It was probably nothing. He bought properties. That was what men with money did. It was almost certainly unrelated, almost certainly coincidence, as he'd said with the exact cadence of a man who knows the word he's using is insufficient. She sat on the edge of her bed. She was 32 years old. She had a degree to finish. She had a call to make in the morning that would change multiple things simultaneously. She had a notebook in her desk drawer with 2 sentences in it that were still true. She also had, and this was the part she couldn't organize into anything clean, the memory of Valerio Moretti standing in her corridor in a jacket without a tie, saying I chose the programs and making it sound like the most natural thing he'd ever said, when it was almost certainly the most costly. She lay back on the bed. She stared at the ceiling. The Christmas lights she'd strung along her own crown molding glowed softly above her, and below them her mind worked and wouldn't stop working, because somewhere in the last 6 hours something fundamental had shifted in the structure of everything. Not just the operation, not just tonight, not just the gala and the terrace and the warehouse and the card and the call she was going to make, but in her, in what she was willing to call her life, and what she was no longer willing to call enough. And in the morning there would be a call, and after the call there would be consequences, and after the consequences there would have to be a decision about what came next. But right now there was just the snow on the window and the lights on the ceiling and the specific silence of Christmas Eve in a house where everyone was pretending to sleep. And somewhere in that silence, the first real question she'd asked herself in 3 years. Not, what do I survive next? But what do I actually... She didn't sleep. Not a single hour of it. She lay on the bed with the Christmas lights glowing on the ceiling and her mind running the same calculations over and over until they stopped being calculations and became something closer to dread. The specific dread of someone who understands that the morning is going to require more from them than they've ever been asked to give, and who isn't sure they have it. At 4:47 a.m., she gave up on pretending. She got up, washed her face, made fresh tea, sat at the desk with Delia Marsh's card in front of her, and her phone beside it, and the notebook open to the 2 sentences she'd written, and she read them again. I am not what this room decided I was. I have been waiting to be for years. Time to stop waiting. She closed the notebook. She picked up the phone. She put it back down. Not yet. It was 5 in the morning on Christmas Day. Delia Marsh was a person with a life outside of foundation work, with family probably, with a morning that didn't yet know what it was about to become. The call could wait 2 hours, 3, long enough to be decent, long enough to be sure. She was still sitting there at 6:15 when the shouting started upstairs. Oh, it came through the ceiling the way sound travels in old buildings, muffled but present. the specific distortion of voices raised past the point of conversation. She couldn't make out words at first, just the quality of it. Two voices, male, one of them climbing in register and one of them staying low, which was almost worse than if both had been shouting. She knew both voices. She stood up. The service stairs were at the end of her corridor, and she took them quickly, not running. She wasn't running. She was moving with purpose, which was different. Up one flight and then another to the main residential level where the sound was coming from. The hall was empty except for soft light from the sconces and the Christmas wreaths still hanging from every doorframe, incongruously cheerful in the context of what was coming through the closed door at the end of the corridor. Valerio's study. She stood outside it for 3 seconds. Told you what the answer was. Valerio's voice, low and even, audible through the door's weight. That answer hasn't changed. You're protecting a federal witness. Carmine. The high one, the climbing one. You understand what that means? You understand what they'll do with that kid if he stays alive He stays alive, flat, final. Valerio. A pause. The silence had a physical quality, compressed. You're choosing a 23-year-old dock worker over 30 years of, I'm choosing not to kill someone to maintain an operation that I've been trying to get out from under for 5 years. A beat. That's what I'm choosing. Another silence. Longer. When Carmine spoke again, his voice had changed register. Dropped. That was somehow more frightening than the shouting. Get out from under, he repeated. That's what you said. Yes. You've been running this operation for 11 years. You built half of it yourself, and you're telling me at 6 in the morning on Christmas Day that you want to— I'm not telling you what I want, Valerio said. I'm telling you what's going to happen. Ferraro stays alive. We cooperate with the investigation. The Alderton warehouse goes dark, permanently. You'll go to prison. Probably. You'll lose everything. Some of it, Valerio said. Not everything. A beat. The maid, Carmine said. The word landed through the door like a stone dropped into water. Serafina's hand was on the wall beside the doorframe. She pressed her palm flat against it. Don't, Valerio said. 3 years she's been in this house and you never looked twice at her. One night in a ballroom and suddenly you're— I said don't. She called Delia Marsh this morning. The information landed between them like a detonation, and even through the door, Serafina felt the shockwave of it. Carmine knew. Somehow Carmine already knew. 6 a.m. She told Marsh about the warehouse funding. Marsh is already on the phone with the foundation board. Serafina went cold from the sternum outward. She had not called Marsh. She had been sitting at her desk with the phone in her hand and the card in front of her, and she had not called anyone. She had been sitting there at 6 a.m. deciding whether to call. Someone had called for her, or someone had called claiming to be her. She had exactly 3 seconds to process the implications of that before the study door opened. Carmine came through the door and almost walked into her. He stopped. His face went through 3 expressions in 1 second: surprise, calculation, and then something that settled into a cold satisfaction that made her stomach turn. Perfect, he said. I didn't make that call, she said. I know. He smiled with his mouth only. I did. She stared at him. Marsh needed to know, he said, with the tone of a man explaining something obvious to someone slow. The foundation pulls their relationship with Valerio. The board starts asking questions. The questions lead to the investigation that's already coming, which means it moves faster and hits harder and lands before Valerio can do whatever he was planning to do with the Ferraro situation. He straightened his jacket. Gratitude's not necessary. You were going to make the call anyway. You used my name. I used the story you started tonight, he said. You stood in that ballroom and made yourself visible. That's not something you can undo. Behind him, Valerio appeared in the doorway. He looked at her first, quick, assessing, the scan of a man confirming status before anything else. And then at Carmine, and what crossed his face was not anger exactly. It was colder than anger, the temperature of a decision being finalized. You're done, Valerio said to Carmine. Carmine turned, and something in Valerio's expression stopped him mid-syllable. A pause. Then the smile came back, but thinner, depleted. You think you can run this without me? After everything— I'm not running this anymore, Valerio said. I told you that 40 minutes ago. Then you're dead in 6 months. Carmine said it without heat, a statement of logistics. You think Benedetti and the Greco people are going to let you just walk away? You think cooperating with federal investigators is something this community forgives? You'll be in protection if you're lucky, and in the ground if you're not. Then that's what happens, Valerio said. Carmine looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted in his face. The last of the performed control dropped off, and what was underneath it was, she saw it clearly. Fear. Not for Valerio. Fear of losing the structure his own life was built on, the architecture of a man whose identity was inseparable from the operation he served. You're throwing your life away, Carmine said, and his voice, for the first time, was simply a voice, no performance in it, just a man saying a true thing. For what? For her, for a bookshop, for the first decision I've made in 11 years that doesn't require me to become less than I started as, Valerio said. The corridor was very quiet. Carmine looked at Serafina once, the look of a man assigning responsibility. Then he walked away down the corridor, and his footsteps were the loudest thing in the building until they faded. Bassa. The next 4 hours moved with the particular velocity of crisis, fast and slow simultaneously, the way serious things move. Valerio made calls. She didn't hear most of them. She sat in the kitchen with tea she wasn't drinking and listened to the quality of the building around her change. Staff arriving early, confused by the energy, the head of House Wentworth moving through the ground floor with the expression of a man managing information he'd rather not have. Maria appeared at 7:30, took one look at Serafina, and set a plate of toast in front of her without comment. Eat, Maria said. I'm not hungry. Eat anyway. Maria sat across from her. Carmine left 20 minutes ago. He took 2 of the security men with him. Serafina looked up. Which 2? She said. De Luca and the young one, Petroni. Maria's hands folded on the table. She looked like a woman doing arithmetic. Petroni has been Carmine since before Valerio. De Luca... She made a gesture. De Luca goes where the money's more certain. They're going to Benedetti, Serafina said. Maria didn't confirm it. She didn't have to. Serafina picked up the toast. She ate half a piece because her body required fuel, and her body was smarter than her right now. Where's Marco? She said. Upstairs with Valerio. Maria studied her. What happened last night? A lot of things. Yes. A pause. I can see that. Maria reached across the table and briefly, precisely, touched the back of Serafina's hand. Whatever it is, you're still here. That's not nothing. Serafina looked at the older woman's hand, at the lines in it, at the evidence of 30-something years of work in houses like this, of watching versions of this same drama from various positions of careful invisibility. How do you do it? Serafina said. How have you stayed here this long? Maria was quiet for a moment. I stopped needing it to be something it isn't, she said. I see it clearly. I take the good where it is. I protect myself where I have to. She stood. What I never did was pretend. She picked up the plate and moved toward the sink. That's the only thing that actually keeps you safe. Pretending makes you fragile. She left Serafina with the half piece of toast and the cold tea. Awesome. At 9:45, Valerio came to find her. He looked like he hadn't slept either. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there yesterday, or that she'd never been close enough to see. His jacket was gone. He was in a dark shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow, the first time she'd ever seen him this undone in the house's common areas. He sat across from her at the kitchen table. Maria was gone. Benedetti knows, he said. I assumed. He's calling an emergency sit-down this afternoon. He looked at the table surface. Benedetti, the Greco people, possibly Harlan from the north side. He looked up. They're going to ask me to reverse the Ferraro decision. And if you don't, he held her gaze, then it becomes a problem that can't be talked through. She understood what he meant. She'd been understanding what men in this operation meant by certain phrases for 3 years. You should leave, he said. Today. The north property. I can have it arranged in 2 hours. And go do what? She said. Sit there and wait? Wait to be safe. Safe to do what? She looked at him. Valerio. Safe to do what? Wait for you to either survive this afternoon or not. And then what? Live in your clean property and... She stopped herself. Breathed. I'm not a thing you put somewhere for safekeeping. His jaw tightened. I know that. Then stop talking to me like I am. He pressed his mouth together. Something moved through his eyes. The afternoon sit-down, he said. Whatever happens at it, I want you out of this estate before it starts. Not because I'm putting you somewhere, because this building is a target site after 2 p.m. and you're... He stopped. I'm what? A pause. The kind that costs something to break. You're the only person I've talked to honestly and longer than I can clearly remember, he said. And I'd like that person to still exist tomorrow. The kitchen was very quiet. She looked at him across the table. This man she'd watched for 3 years from the careful distance of invisibility, whose complexity she'd been cataloging without permission, whose worst and best she'd seen in the space of a single evening, and felt the particular vertigo of a moment that demands a decision before you're ready to make it. I'm not leaving before the sit-down, she said. Serafina, I'm not. She held his gaze. But I'll stay out of the operational areas. I'll stay in the East Wing. He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him calculating. The risk assessment of a man who'd been doing risk assessments his entire professional life now being applied to something he clearly did not know how to quantify. East Wing, he said finally. East Wing, she confirmed. He stood, looked at her once more with an expression she was beginning to be able to name, which was part of what made it dangerous. Don't open the door to anyone who isn't me or Marco, he said. He left the kitchen. She sat there for 60 seconds. Then she got up and went to the East Wing. What? The sit-down was scheduled for 2 p.m. At 1:15, Marco knocked on the door of the East Wing's small sitting room where she'd positioned herself with a book she wasn't reading and a clear line of sight to both the room's entrance and its window. They're here, he said through the door. How many? Benedetti came with 5 men. Greco sent his son, Luca Greco, 28, runs the South District. Harlan's not coming. Why not? Harlan's already talking to Federal, Marco said. A pause. Independently. She processed that. Does Valerio know? He knows. Does Benedetti know Harlan is talking? Not yet. Another pause. That's a complication. She stood up from the chair. Marco. She kept her voice even. What's the actual temperature on this? Not the managed version, the real one. A long silence. It's bad, he said. Benedetti doesn't come personally unless he's prepared to make a final decision. He sent 5 men. That's not negotiation security. He stopped. That's insurance. She looked at the door. Is Valerio armed? She said. Yes. Is he going to use it? He's going to try not to. She put her hand on the door handle. I'm coming out. That is a terrible... She opened the door. Marco was standing in the corridor with the expression of a man whose objections had already been overruled and who was adjusting to the new reality with the pragmatism of someone who had done this before. East Wing to the main corridor is 40 feet, he said. You don't go past the main corridor. Agreed? Agreed, she said. They walked. That's it. The main corridor at 40 feet gave her a direct line of sight through the study's open double doors. She could see the room without being in it. That was the calculation she'd made, present enough to understand what was happening, positioned where her presence was not yet a variable in the equation. Benedetti was 63, gray-haired, built with the compacted solidity of a man who had never needed to perform physical threat because his history performed it for him. He sat in the study's armchair with his hands on his knees and the stillness of someone who had been in rooms like this more times than he could count. His 5 men stood distributed around the room's edges, not aggressive positioning, not yet, but loaded. Luca Greco was standing near the fireplace, young, lean, with the specific restlessness of someone who has power he hasn't fully figured out how to wear. His eyes moved more than Benedetti's. That made him more unpredictable. Valerio stood near the desk. Marco had taken a position near the door. The Ferraro situation, Benedetti said, and his voice was the room temperature of someone discussing mild weather. You refused Carmine's recommendation. I gave Carmine my decision, Valerio said. He disagreed with it. Carmine's been with this operation for 19 years. I know. You sent him away this morning. He left, Valerio said. I didn't send him. Benedetti absorbed that. The boy talked to Federal. He told them about the dock operation. That dock connects to the Alderton warehouse, which connects to your name on a lease. He tilted his head slightly. How would you like to address that? By cooperating with the investigation, Valerio said. The room temperature dropped 5 degrees. Luca Greco's hand moved, not toward anything, just a movement, the body's autonomic response to a shock. One of Benedetti's men shifted his weight. Benedetti looked at Valerio for a long time without speaking. Say that again, he said. Cooperate with the federal investigation, Valerio said. Close the Alderton operation. Redirect what can be redirected into legitimate channels. Accept whatever comes legally. You'd name names, Benedetti said. I'd name what the investigation already has or will find without my help, Valerio said. I'm not interested in trading people. I'm interested in being done. Done. Benedetti repeated the word like it was in a foreign language. Done. Yes. A pause. Valerio. Benedetti's voice was almost gentle. You're not done until I say you're done. That's not how this has ever worked. I know, Valerio said. I'm telling you how it's going to work from my end regardless. The room was completely still. At 40 feet down the corridor, Serafina's hand was pressed flat against the wall, and her heart was hitting her sternum with a regularity she was consciously aware of. Each beat distinct, countable, the body's reminder that it was present and would like to remain so. Luca Greco moved away from the fireplace. This is embarrassing, he said. He was addressing Benedetti, not Valerio, talking about Valerio in the third person while standing 8 feet from him, which was itself a statement. He's been running his own departure plan, and he brought us here to hear about it. He looked at Valerio. You think you can just... Luca. Benedetti's voice was flat. Luca stopped. Benedetti stood up. He was not a tall man, but the act of standing changed the room's geometry entirely. He buttoned his jacket with the deliberate care of a man performing patience. I'm going to give you until 6 p.m., he said to Valerio, to reconsider. I won't reconsider. Until 6 p.m., Benedetti repeated, as though Valerio hadn't spoken. After which, whatever happens is your responsibility. He looked around the room once with the attention of a man doing an inventory. His eyes moved to the doorway, past it, down the corridor. They found Serafina. The moment lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Benedetti's expression did not change at all. Not a muscle, not an eyelid. And that absolute blankness was more frightening than anything else in the room. He looked away. 6 p.m., he said to Valerio. He walked out. His 5 men moved with him. Luca Greco followed, throwing a look at Valerio that promised something he didn't have the authority to deliver yet. The sound of the front entrance opening and closing, then silence. Serafina realized she had been holding her breath and released it as quietly as she could. Marco had his hand over his eyes. A single slow exhale. Valerio turned. He looked down the corridor at her. 40 feet of Persian carpet, and Christmas wreaths and the mundane physical evidence of a house that had no idea it had just become the site of something irreversible. She looked back. His face was... She searched it, the way she'd been searching it for hours, for days, for 3 years if she was being honest. And what she found now, underneath the composure and the calculation and the weight of 11 years of decisions that had compounded interest into this specific afternoon, was something that looked like a man who had just walked through a door and found it locked behind him. Not regret. Something more honest than regret. The understanding that there was no corridor back, only forward, into whatever 6 p.m. became. She walked toward him. All 40 feet of it, past the wreaths and the sconces, and the Christmas morning quiet of a house in the last hours of whatever it had been. She stopped 3 feet away. You should have led with the cooperation angle, she said. Rather than the Ferraro decision, it would have given Benedetti less specific leverage. He stared at her for a moment. That's your response to what just happened? I'm processing, she said. This is how I process. Something moved across his face that was almost something lighter than the weight it had been carrying. They'll come back before 6, he said. Yes. Luca Greco specifically. He can't afford to let Benedetti be the one who... He stopped. He needs to prove something. Marco, she said, raising her voice slightly. Marco lowered his hand from his eyes. Yeah. Does this estate have a secure room? Marco looked at Valerio. Valerio looked at Serafina. Yes, Marco said. How secure? Reinforced door, independent comms, food and water for 72 hours. A pause. We used to use it for... He stopped. It's secure. Then between now and 6 p.m., Serafina said, we use it. We, Valerio said. She met his eyes. You heard me. You don't have to... We already went through this, she said. I know I don't have to. I'm choosing to. She held his gaze. That's what choosing looks like when it's real. He looked at her for a long moment in the corridor of his own house on Christmas morning, with the investigation closing in and the 6 p.m. deadline counting down, and the certainty of consequences lined up in every direction. The secure room is in the West Wing, he said. Then let's go, she said. They moved. The West Wing's secure room was not what she'd pictured when Marco described it. It was a converted bedroom, solidly reinforced, yes, with a steel core door and an independent power supply humming behind a panel in the wall, but it had been furnished by someone who understood that function and humanity were not mutually exclusive. A table, 4 chairs, a small shelving unit with books and supplies, a window of reinforced glass too narrow to be a vulnerability, but wide enough to show the estate's snow-covered north garden. She stood at that window while Valerio took the chair nearest the communications panel and Marco ran through the system's status. Outside, snow was still falling on Christmas morning, gentle now, the violent accumulation of the night before giving way to something quieter. The estate's garden was pristine white, with the shallow shapes of the decorative hedges showing through. A bird landed on the nearest hedge, sat there for a moment, flew away. She watched it go. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Delia Marsh. She stared at the name for 2 beats. Then she picked up. Ms. Vale. Marsh's voice was controlled, but moving underneath the control, the way rivers move under ice. I received a call this morning, someone representing themselves as you. That wasn't me, Serafina said. I didn't think so. A pause. I'd like to hear it from you. Serafina turned slightly away from Valerio and Marco. Not far. Just enough. What was said in the call? She asked. The Alderton warehouse. The funding chain. The connection between the Moretti organization's charitable contributions and an operation under federal investigation. Marsh's voice was very precise. The foundation board is meeting at noon. I need to know what you know, directly. She looked at the window, at the snow garden, at the empty space where the bird had been. How much time do you have? Serafina said. As much as this requires, Marsh said. She breathed once, then she told her, all of it. Not with drama, not with judgment, just with the clean precision of a person delivering information that the recipient deserved to have, and that she, Serafina, had spent too long not delivering out of a survival calculus that had always been temporary and had just run out. She talked for 11 minutes. Marsh was silent for most of it. When Serafina finished, the silence held for a moment. Thank you, Marsh said. I'm sorry it took this long. You're telling me now, Marsh said. That matters. A pause. The January invitation stands, Ms. Vale. Whatever else happens, that stands. The call ended. Serafina put the phone in her pocket. She turned. Valerio was looking at her. He'd heard enough of her side of the conversation to understand the shape of it. His face was doing the complicated thing again, several things at once. None of them the controlled mask, all of them more honest than he probably intended. It's done, she said. Yes. She met his gaze across the small room. Whatever comes from that, I know. I told you I wouldn't stop you. You didn't. She crossed to the table and sat down. So, here we are. He looked at her for a moment longer, then he sat too. Marco was at the communications panel, monitoring frequencies, giving them the deliberate privacy of a man staring very hard at equipment. The room was quiet. Outside, snow fell on the garden. The clock on the wall read 1:48 p.m., 4 hours and 12 minutes to 6 o'clock. And then, The communications panel crackled. Marco stiffened. "What?" Valerio said. "Perimeter camera?" Marco's voice had gone flat and professional in a way that Serafina recognized from the estate's most tense evenings. "East gate. 3 vehicles." He looked at Valerio. "They didn't wait for 6. The room shifted. Not physically, but everything in it, the air, the quality of the silence, the weight of the next seconds, rearranged itself around the understanding that the deadline had been a courtesy they were never intended to honor. Valerio stood. Marco was already at the door. Serafina stood too. "No," Valerio said. "I'm not staying in this room alone," she said. "Serafina, I am not." She held his gaze. "Tell me what you need me to do and I will do it. But I am not sitting in here while—" A sound from somewhere in the estate, distant, directional. The specific percussion of a door not opened, but forced. They were already inside. Valerio looked at her with the expression of a man whose calculations had just run out of room, every contingency exhausted, standing at the precise point where preparation ended, and whatever came next was simply what it was. He reached past her to the shelf behind the table. He set something on the table between them. A phone, a number already pulled up on the screen. 3 digits. "If I tell you to call," he said, "you call. Immediately. Without waiting to see why." She looked at the phone, looked at him. "And if you don't tell me," she said. He held her gaze. "Then I didn't need you to," he said, "and we walk out of here together." The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside, multiple, fast, the rhythm of men moving with purpose through a building they'd been in before and knew the layout of. Marco's hand was on the door. Valerio turned to face it, and Serafina Vale, who had spent 3 years learning to be invisible, who had walked into a ballroom 24 hours ago in emerald velvet and reclaimed something she'd buried, who had made a phone call that changed the shape of everything and was still standing, still present, still entirely herself, put her hand flat on the table beside the phone and felt her heartbeat in her palm, steady and countable and alive, and waited for the door to. The door held for 4 seconds. Then it opened from the inside, Marco pulling it, not the men in the corridor forcing it. And Serafina understood in the half second before anything else registered that Marco had made a calculation she hadn't been party to. He stepped into the corridor with his hands visible and his voice already moving, talking to someone she couldn't see yet. The specific cadence of a man buying time through the performance of cooperation. She heard 2 voices respond. Then a third. Valerio moved to the doorframe without crossing it. She stayed at the table with her hand on the surface beside the phone and her heartbeat in her ears steady and too loud, the body insisting on its own presence in situations where presence felt like a liability. She could see a partial angle of the corridor from where she stood. Luca Greco. She recognized him from the study. The lean restlessness, the quality of someone wearing authority that didn't quite fit yet. He had 2 men flanking him, and he was looking at Marco with the expression of someone who had been given a job to do and was committed to doing it regardless of cost. "Where is he?" Luca said. "Mr. Moretti is in conference," Marco said. "That's not what I asked." "I understood the question," Marco said. "I'm giving you the available answer." A pause. Serafina watched Luca's jaw work. He was 28 years old, and he was standing in someone else's house on Christmas Day, trying to conduct himself like his father's generation, and the seams were showing. "Benedetti sent us," Luca said. "I know who sent you." "Then you know this isn't optional." "Nothing's optional," Marco said. "That doesn't mean everything's immediate." He held Luca's gaze with the patience of a man who had been doing this specific kind of standing down for 15 years. "Give me 10 minutes. Let me tell him you're here. He'll come out." Luca looked past Marco toward the secure room's door. Serafina took 1 step back, out of the angle of his sightline. 5 minutes, Luca said. 10, Marco said. Because 5 tells him he doesn't matter, and that makes this harder for everyone. Another pause. 8, Luca said finally, which told her he was 28 years old and still negotiating the middle ground even when he'd been sent not to. Marco stepped back and pulled the door half closed. He looked at Valerio. A wordless exchange, the compressed communication of 2 men who had been in tight situations before and had developed a shared language for them. Valerio turned to her. "The phone," he said quietly, "so call now." She looked at him. Before 8 minutes runs out, he said. Before it becomes something Luca has to follow through on to save face. He held her gaze. Call now while it's still a choice. She picked up the phone. She looked at the 3 digits on the screen. Her thumb moved. The federal response time was 11 minutes. She knew this later. 11 minutes from her call to the first vehicle at the estate's east gate, which was fast enough that someone had been watching, waiting, already positioned in the general vicinity for reasons that had to do with the Ferraro investigation and the dock operation and the accumulated attention of a task force that had been building its case for 2 years. In those 11 minutes, 3 things happened. Marco kept Luca Greco in the corridor through a combination of patience and the specific social physics of a young man not wanting to be the one who broke the negotiation first. She heard their voices through the door. Not the words, just the texture of it, the back and forth of 2 people buying and spending time in equal measure. Valerio sat at the table, not standing, not pacing. Sitting, with his hands flat on the table surface and his eyes on the middle distance, the posture of a man who has made every decision available to him and is now simply waiting for the world to catch up to those decisions. She sat across from him. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Outside the reinforced window, snow fell on the north garden. The light had shifted, late morning moving toward noon, the winter sky pale and even, the kind of light that made everything look slightly unreal. The thesis, Valerio said finally. She looked at him. You'll finish it, he said. Not a question. Yes. The invisible women in the center of the painting. Yes. He looked at his hands on the table. I want to read it, he said. When it's done. She held on to the weight of that for a moment. The specific intimacy of it, not a declaration, not a promise, just the quiet statement of a man expressing a future he was not sure he'd be free to participate in, and reaching toward it anyway with the only tool available, words. It'll be 2 years, she said. At least. I know. Depending on what happens today. I know that too. She looked at him across the table, at his hands, at the lines around his eyes she'd been close enough to see for the first time today, at the specific quality of his stillness, which she'd spent 3 years cataloging as controlled, and was now understanding as something more layered. Not control as suppression, but control as the last form of integrity available to a man who had given most of the others away. Why the North property? She said. He met her eyes. 3 years ago, she said. The year I came to work here. You bought a clean property with no operational connection. She held his gaze. I need to understand that. The silence that followed was the kind that has history in it. I read your employment file when you arrived, he said. Standard practice. I review everyone's. He paused. Yours was different. Different how? The university degree, the thesis topic, the reason you'd left. He looked at the window, at the snow garden. I looked at your file and I understood that you were someone who had been rerouted by circumstances into a place that was not your destination. He turned back to her. I've rerouted a lot of people in my life, intentionally, for the operation. His voice was even, but something underneath it was not. Reading your file was the first time I'd seen it happen to someone by pure circumstance and felt accountable for it, even though I hadn't done it. She studied him. That's not a full answer, she said. No, he agreed. It's not. He held her gaze. The full answer is that I bought the property 3 months after you arrived because I wanted there to be something clean in my possession. Something that couldn't be touched by what the rest of my life was. He stopped. Whether I ever used it wasn't the point. Having it was the point. She absorbed that. That's a very indirect way, she said carefully, of saying something directly. I know, he said. I'm working on that. Outside in the corridor, the sound of voices changed register. Then, the front of the estate. Vehicles, doors. Marco's voice, louder now, addressing someone new. Luca Greco's voice, losing its careful modulation, surprise bleeding through the edges. Valerio stood. He looked at her once, completely, directly, the full attention she'd been receiving in fragments all evening and was now receiving in full. A look that cataloged and acknowledged and held without asking anything back. And then he walked to the door and opened it. She followed. The federal agents came in through 3 entrances simultaneously. She knew this because she could hear it. The coordinated quality of multiple entry points, the specific acoustic signature of a building being entered with purpose from different directions. By the time she and Valerio reached the main corridor, 6 agents were moving through the ground floor with the efficient, impersonal motion of people executing a process. Luca Greco was standing very still near the study entrance with his hands visible and his face doing something complicated. The expression of a 28-year-old man recalculating rapidly what this situation now required of him in terms of self-preservation versus the job Benedetti had sent him to do. She watched him make the calculation, watched him choose himself. He looked at Valerio once. "Benedetti sent me," he said, as if establishing the record. "I know," Valerio said. "Tell him what you saw." Luca Greco looked at the agents moving through the corridor. Something shifted in his face, not quite shame, but adjacent. The look of someone who has understood, in a moment of clarity he didn't plan for, that the structure he's been operating inside is not going to survive the morning. He nodded once, stiffly. An agent appeared at Valerio's shoulder. Young, professional, with the practiced neutrality of someone trained to process human complexity without absorbing it personally. "Mr. Moretti, I need you to come with me." Valerio turned to her. She was right there, 3 feet, close enough that she could see him breathing, the slow, deliberate breath of a man maintaining composure through an act of will. "The Alderton programs," he said quietly. "Whatever the foundation decides, the bookshop's lease is paid through the next 3 years. Renata doesn't know about the source. She doesn't need to know. The lease is clean from a trust. It won't be touched by the investigation." She stared at him. "You arranged that already." "This morning," he said, "before 6 a.m. Before she'd even woken up. Before Carmine had made the call pretending to be her. Before any of it." She looked at him and felt the full weight of what it meant. A man taking action on behalf of something he cared about at the earliest possible moment, before outcome was certain, before anyone could observe the act and use it as evidence of character, because he didn't need the audience. "Mr. Moretti," the agent said again. Valerio looked at her for one more moment. 2 years, he said. 2 years, she said. He turned and walked with the agent down the corridor. She watched his back, the same back she'd watched moving through rooms for 3 years, always ahead, always in command of the space he occupied, and watched it carry itself with the same quality it always had, even now, even through this, not defiant exactly, but simply present, simply himself, all the way to the estate's front entrance and through it. The door closed. She stood in the corridor. Marco appeared at her elbow. He looked at the closed door, said nothing for a long moment. "He knew this was coming," Marco said finally. "Not today specifically, but something like today." He turned the statement over. "He's been positioning for it for 2 years. The trust for the bookshop, the clean money in certain places. The Ferraro decision." He looked at her. "He was building a record." "A record of what?" she said. "Of being something different than what the operation made him." Marco was quiet for a moment. "Whether it's enough, legally, in terms of cooperation credit, I don't know. But it exists." She looked at the front door. "Where will they take him?" "Processing, then probably a federal holding facility while they work out the cooperation agreement." Marco looked at her. "It could be months, could be longer." She absorbed that. "The estate," she said. "The estate gets tied up in asset review. Staff will be given notice." He paused. "That includes you." She nodded. She turned and walked back toward the east wing. She packed in 40 minutes. It wasn't much. 3 years in a room that size and the discipline of someone who had learned not to accumulate. 2 bags, manageable. She moved through the small space methodically, taking what was hers and leaving what wasn't. And she did not think about what it meant to be leaving, because if she started thinking about that, she would stop moving, and she needed to keep moving. The emerald dress went in first, carefully in its garment bag, laid flat across the top of the larger bag. The notebook. Delia Marsh's card, which had survived the night in her coat pocket and was slightly bent at one corner. The string of Christmas lights she'd put up in her room. She unplugged them, wound them carefully, put them in the bag. Maria could use them somewhere. Or she would. She sat on the edge of the bed for a moment when the bags were packed. The room looked exactly like it had before she'd put the lights up. Bed, desk, wardrobe. Window at ground level showing snow and pine tree legs. It was just a room. It had been just a room. She had made it briefly something else through the small act of stringing lights along a ceiling, and now it was just a room again, and that was fine. That was the correct relationship to have with rooms. She picked up the bags. Maria was in the kitchen when she passed through. The older woman looked at the bags without surprise. "Where will you go?" Maria said. "There's a property on the north end." She set the bags down for a moment. "Clean money. I checked." She paused. "He left the address with Marco. Apparently he left a lot of things with Marco." Maria was quiet for a moment. Then, "That man has been doing things quietly for a long time," she said. Not with softness, with the precision of a woman stating an observed fact. "Some of them terrible. Some of them, She stopped. "Not." "I know," Serafina said. "That doesn't balance out." "I know that too." She picked the bags back up. "It just means he's a person, same as everyone." Maria looked at her for a long moment. Then she came around the kitchen island and put her arms around Serafina with the brief, complete embrace of a woman who had been offering this kind of contact for decades and knew exactly how long to hold it. "January," Maria said, releasing her. "You'll be at the foundation meeting." "January 15th, Serafina said. "Good." Maria stepped back, straightened her uniform. "Go! Before the asset review, people get here and complicate things." Serafina went. The north property was a 20-minute drive from the estate. She took a cab because Marco had offered her the estate's car and she'd said no, it wasn't hers to use. And this felt important. The distinction between what was offered and what was owned, between using someone else's resources and building your own forward motion. The cab driver had a small Christmas decoration on his dashboard, a paper star, similar to the one she'd seen in the apartment window the night before. He had the radio on low, a holiday station playing something instrumental. She looked out the window at the city going past, Christmas Day in the snow. The streets were quieter than usual. Families inside, the particular stillness of a city observing its own occasion. She watched storefronts and apartment buildings, and the specific texture of neighborhoods she'd moved through for years without fully looking at, and she looked at them now the way you look at things when you understand you're going to be describing them later. She thought about her mother, Constance Vale, who had cleaned offices for 19 years and known every person's name in the building she worked in, and none of them had known hers. Constance Vale, who had hung decorations every year, even in the bad years, who had made apartments smell like cinnamon and oranges, and had said, "You celebrate because that's how you remember what you're fighting for." She hadn't celebrated in 2 years. Not really. She'd helped other people's houses celebrate. She'd wound garlands and hung wreaths and positioned ornaments and stood back to make sure the angles were right. And she'd done it with the professional competence of someone who understood the task without feeling its purpose. Last night she'd put Christmas lights in her own room. Small, late, barely, but it was a start. The cab pulled up to an address on Calloway Street, North End, residential, a row of narrow brownstones with snow on their stoops and Christmas lights in most of their windows. The property was a second-floor apartment in a building that looked like it had been maintained by someone who understood the difference between upkeep and indifference. Clean exterior, good windows, a small brass number plate on the door that read 14. She paid the driver. She stood on the stoop with her 2 bags and the key Marco had given her, actual brass, old-fashioned, the kind that felt substantial in a hand. And she looked at the door of an apartment she hadn't chosen and didn't yet know, and understood that this was what forward looked like sometimes. Standing in front of a door you didn't pick in a neighborhood, you didn't know with 2 bags that were all your own. She unlocked the door. The apartment was clean and spare and smelled of fresh paint and something underlaid that was just the specific smell of a space that had been cared for and not lived in. Hardwood floors. Good light from large windows facing the street. A small kitchen with a window above the sink showing the building's back garden, snow-covered, with a single bird feeder mounted on a post. A bedroom. A desk near the window. She set her bags down in the center of the living room. She stood there for a moment. Then she opened the larger bag and took out the string of Christmas lights. She found an outlet near the window. She wound the lights along the window frame shut. Not perfectly, no crown molding here to use as a guide, just the frame itself, and plugged them in. They came on immediately, warm and small and present. She stepped back and looked at them. Outside the window, snow fell on Calloway Street, on the brownstones and the parked cars and the city going about its Christmas. Inside, the lights reflected in the glass and doubled, the warm, small dots multiplying against the winter dark outside. She thought about the thesis, about the invisible women placed at the center of canvases and rendered invisible through the choices of artists who decided what the eye should follow. About the specific injustice of being present and not seen, not through any failure of your own substance, but through the active, practiced indifference of the people with the power to look. She was going to write about it properly. She was going to finish the degree and write the thesis, and she was going to do it in this apartment, at the desk near the window, with the Christmas lights in the frame and the bird feeder in the back garden, and whatever came next coming at its own pace. She picked up her phone. Not Marsh. She'd already spoken to Marsh, and January 15th was on the calendar in her mind with the clarity of something load-bearing. Not Marco. He had enough to manage. She opened a new note. She typed, "Things that are mine." Then she sat at the desk and began to list them. The degree, the thesis, the knowledge of Alderton that Delia Marsh wanted at a planning table, the conversation she'd had with Thomas Harfield about the literacy programs, the 14 minutes she'd spent with Delia Marsh in the ballroom before any of the night's other events had overtaken everything, the card in her coat pocket, the notebook with 2 sentences in it, the memory of walking into the Grand Meridian's ballroom in emerald velvet and feeling, for the first time in a very long time, that she was arriving somewhere rather than enduring somewhere, the conversation on the estate terrace in the snow, the kitchen table, the corridor outside the secure room, 2 years. She stopped typing. She looked at the list, then she added one more thing, the lights in the window. She closed the note. She stood and went to the kitchen and opened the cabinets one by one. Someone had stocked them, minimally but thoughtfully, the basics. And she found a kettle and tea and a single mug, and she made tea the way she'd been making it her whole life, the way her mother had made it, water just off the boil and 3 minutes exactly. She stood at the kitchen window with the mug in both hands and looked at the bird feeder in the back garden. A bird landed on it, small, brown, unremarkable in the way that things are unremarkable until you start looking. It sat on the feeder and ate with the complete attention of something doing exactly what it was built to do, unaware of being observed, unaware of the window and the woman on the other side of it, and the tea and the Christmas lights in the front room and the 2 bags in the center of the living room floor. Just present. Just itself. She watched it until it flew away. She called Marco 3 days after Christmas. "How is it?" she asked. "Federal holding," Marco said. "The cooperation agreement is moving. His lawyer says the record he built, the trust, the clean transfers, the Ferraro decision, it matters. Not a free pass, but it matters. Timeline, year, maybe more, depending." A pause. "He asked me to tell you the Fourth Estate Books held its first post-holiday reading session yesterday. 12 kids. Renata says it's the highest turnout they've had." She stood at the front window with the phone and looked at Calloway Street. "Tell him—" She stopped. "Yeah," Marco said. "Tell him the lights are on," she said. A pause. "He'll understand that," Marco said. "I know," she said. "Yep, ma'am." January 15th was a Tuesday. She wore her gray wool coat and good boots, and she arrived at the Beaumont Foundation's offices 8 minutes early, which was her habit. Delia Marsh met her at the door with the expression of someone who had been doing this work long enough to recognize when a room was about to become better. There were 7 people at the planning table. Serafina sat down at it. Not at the edge. Not in the peripheral position of someone uncertain of their welcome. At the center where the work was. Marsh put a folder in front of her, Schaukage, program documentation, community surveys, funding gaps, and said, "Walk us through what you see." Serafina opened the folder. She looked at the data, which told a story she already knew from the inside, which was the only way stories worth telling were ever known. And she began. 1 year later, on the first Friday of December, she submitted her thesis. 212 pages. The invisible women, the center of the canvas, the technique of absence, The argument, careful, documented, built on 3 years of research conducted in an apartment on Calloway Street at a desk near a window with lights in the frame, that presence is not the same as visibility, and that visibility is not the same as recognition, and that recognition is what art is supposed to make possible if the people making it are brave enough to look at what's actually there. Her advisor read it in 4 days and sent back a single line. This is the work. Submit it. She submitted it. She sat at the desk afterward with the apartment quiet around her and felt something settle in her chest. Not triumph, not relief exactly, but the specific sensation of a weight carried so long you'd stopped feeling it as weight until the moment it was gone. She picked up her phone. She opened the note she'd made on Christmas Day, things that are mine, and added one line, the thesis. Done. She closed the note. She made tea. She stood at the kitchen window and looked at the bird feeder and thought about the 12 months between that Christmas Day and this December afternoon, the planning table, the Alderton restructure that had shifted 3 programs from donor-dependent to community-governed, the 6 months she'd spent working alongside Renata at Fourth Estate Books on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons teaching a reading group she hadn't planned to teach but had stayed for because the kids were exact and unsentimental and funnier than anyone else she spent time with. She thought about a conversation she'd had with Marco in March. A brief update. Cooperation process moving. Record acknowledged. Sentencing hearing scheduled. She thought about 2 years, and what it meant actually, in practice, not as a romantic concept but as a real thing between real people. 2 years of absence. 2 years of a person existing in your life as a series of secondhand updates, and the memory of a look across a kitchen table, and the weight of a statement made quietly in a basement corridor. You're the only person I've talked to honestly in longer than I can clearly remember. She'd written letters. Actual letters. Paper. The kind she'd learned from her mother, who had believed that handwriting told things about a person that other forms of communication couldn't. She'd sent 4. She'd received 3 back. The 3 letters were in her desk drawer. She'd read them enough times to have them in memory, but she read them from the physical pages anyway, the same way she reread certain books, not for the information, but for the experience of the thing itself. He wrote like he spoke, economically, precisely, with the occasional line that stopped her completely because of its honesty. One line from the second letter. I spent 11 years building something that looked like power and functioned like a cage. I understand the thesis better than you might expect. She had sat with that for a long time. She went to the desk drawer now and took out the letters. Read them once, standing, the way you read things that are important enough to deserve your full upright attention. Then she put them back. She looked at the Christmas lights in the window. Still there, renewed in October when the original string had given out, wound into the same frame, same warm, small dots against the winter outside. There was a knock at the door. She went to the door and opened it. Marco stood on the stoop with snow on his shoulders and an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Something lighter than his usual operating face, something that hadn't fully arrived yet but was on its way. Sentencing was this morning, he said. She held the door frame. Time served and 3 years supervised release, Marco said. The cooperation credit and the record. The judge mentioned the record specifically. He paused. He's out. She stood in the doorway of her apartment on Calloway Street and felt the information move through her the way significant things move. Not dramatically, not with the physical sensation of crisis that she'd come to associate with important moments in the last year, but quietly, thoroughly. The way warmth moves through a cold room when the heat finally comes on. Where is he? She said. Carver Street, Marco said. Fourth Estate Books. He looked at her steadily. He said he wanted to see where the rent had been going. She looked at Marco for a moment. He walked out of a federal facility and went directly to a bookshop, she said. Yes. She held on to that. Then she got her coat. Carver Street in December had the quality of neighborhoods that haven't been entirely swallowed yet. A few original storefronts surviving between the newer developments, the specific texture of a block that remembers itself. Fourth Estate Books occupied the ground floor of a narrow building 3 doors from the corner, its window full of handmade display cards, and a rotating collection of children's artwork that Renata changed every 2 weeks. Today's display included a drawing of a bird feeder rendered in crayon. She recognized the artist's style. One of the Tuesday group. She stopped outside the window and looked in. Valerio was at the back of the shop. He was standing at the shelving unit along the east wall with a book open in his hands, reading, with the complete attention of someone who had been in rooms where reading was not possible and was now recovering the ability in real time. He was in a dark coat, no tie, hair slightly longer than she remembered. He looked like a man who had been somewhere difficult and had come back with something that difficult places sometimes give you, a specific quality of presence, the presence of someone who has stopped taking presence for granted. Renata was behind the counter watching him with the fond, slightly confused expression of a woman who had received an unexpected but welcome visitor and was not entirely sure of the protocol. Serafina pushed the door open. The bell above it rang. Renata looked up. Valerio didn't, for 1 second, still on the page, finishing the sentence. The gesture of someone who has learned to complete things before looking up, which was new. Then he looked up. She stood in the doorway of Fourth Estate Books, with the cold coming in behind her and the smell of paper and old wood and Renata's particular tea in the air, and she looked at him across a room full of books, and she felt, not the vertigo of the gala, not the compressed electricity of the terrace, or the corridor, or the secure room, but something quieter and more durable than any of those things. Recognition. The simple recognition of two people who have been entirely honest with each other at the exact moments when honesty costs the most, and who are standing here now with that record between them, not as a debt, but as a foundation. He closed the book. He walked toward her. He stopped 2 feet away and looked at her the way he'd looked at her across the kitchen table on Christmas morning. Completely, without the managed surface, with all the complicated and honest layers that she'd been learning to read for a year through letters and secondhand updates and the specific knowledge that comes from absence. "You finished the thesis," he said. "This afternoon," she said. He nodded once. Something moved through his face. "I'd like to read it," he said. "I know," she said. "You mentioned that. A year ago. I have a good memory." He looked at her for a moment. The corner of his mouth moved. Not the cold performed thing she'd watched him do for 3 years at the head of his table, but something real and small and careful. The expression of a man who has not had much practice with the genuine version and is choosing to try it anyway. "The bird feeder," he said. "In the back garden. You mentioned it in one of the letters." "Still there?" she said. "Birds using it?" "Regularly." He nodded, as if this were information of the highest importance, as if bird feeders in December were the correct unit of measurement for whether a life was being properly built. "Renata," she said, without looking away from him. "Yes?" From behind the counter, carefully neutral. "Can I borrow the back room for 20 minutes? "It's all yours," Renata said, with the specific serenity of a woman who has survived enough to recognize the right moment when she sees it. She turned and walked toward the back of the shop. She heard him follow. The back room at Fourth Estate Books was where Renata kept the overflow stock and the supplies for the reading program. Boxes of paperbacks, stacks of workbooks, a low table surrounded by mismatched chairs scaled for children. The walls were covered in the accumulated artwork of 4 years of reading groups. Paper stars and book covers, and self-portraits and animals rendered in the specific confident style of children who have not yet learned to doubt their own vision. She stood in the center of it and turned to face him. He stood in the doorway and looked at the room, at the children's artwork, at the small chairs, at the evidence of years of something real happening in a space funded quietly and without acknowledgement, and she watched him absorb it. He pressed his mouth together once. "This is what it looked like," he said quietly. Not to her exactly, to the room. "This is what it looked like," she confirmed. He looked at her. "I have 3 years of supervised release," he said. "Conditions? Check-ins? Geographic restrictions for the first year." He held her gaze with the directness she'd come to understand as his most honest mode. "I'm not an easy situation. I'm aware. The operation is gone. Most of the money is in asset recovery. I have the properties that were in the trust and enough to live carefully." He paused. "That's what I have." "That's quite a lot, actually," she said. He looked at her. "A trust that's clean," she said. 3 years to build something from scratch. The practice of being honest when it costs you." She looked at him steadily. "Some people live entire lives without having all 3 of those at once." He was quiet for a moment. "The thesis," he said. The invisible women, the center of the canvas. Yes. You're going to make people look, he said. I'm going to try. You're going to succeed, he said, with the certainty of a man stating a fact, and it landed differently than reassurance, differently than encouragement. It landed like information, like someone who had watched what she did in a ballroom, in a foundation planning room, in a bookshop reading group, and was simply reporting what he'd observed. She looked at him in the back room of Fourth Estate Books, surrounded by children's paper stars and the evidence of 4 years of something real and small and necessary, with the December cold still in her coat and his first day of freedom still in the quality of his presence, and she felt the full weight of the last year. The thesis, the table, the letters, the bird feeder, the lights in the window, settle into its proper proportion. Not a beginning, not a conclusion. The specific ordinary continuing of two people who have been through something and are standing on the other side of it intact, which is the only kind of happy ending that holds. She reached into her coat pocket. She took out the third letter. His third letter, the one she carried, the one with the line she'd read enough times to have in memory but preferred to hold in paper. She held it out to him. He looked at it. Then he took it. He unfolded it, read the line he'd written. She could tell by the way his eyes moved. 2 seconds, the short distance of a single sentence. He looked up. You kept it, he said. All 3, she said. In the desk drawer. He looked at her for a long moment in the quiet of the back room. Then he folded the letter with the same care she'd used and put it in his coat pocket. Coffee, he said. There's a place on Carver Street, 2 doors down. I know it, she said. Then you know if it is any good. It's good, she said. He nodded. He turned toward the door. She walked beside him, not behind him, not ahead, the specific geometry of beside, which is its own statement about every room that comes after. They walked out through the bookshop, past Renata, who said nothing but whose expression said a considerable amount, and through the front door and out into Carver Street in December, with the snow still falling and the city doing what cities do regardless of the particular human dramas occurring inside them. Moving, persisting, going about the complicated ordinary business of being alive. 2 doors down, the coffee shop's window showed warm light, and 2 empty chairs at the table closest to the glass. She saw them before he did. She had always noticed things nobody else bothered to. She walked toward the door and he walked beside her, and above them the snow fell on Carver Street with the particular indifference of weather, and inside the coffee shop the empty chairs waited with the particular patience of things that don't know they're being moved toward, but are there regardless. She pushed the door open. They went inside. And the snow kept falling on the city, on the bookshop, and the bird feeder, and the lights in the window on Callaway Street on the Alderton Community Center, where 12 kids would show up on Tuesday to read, on the brownstones and the storefronts, and the long, complicated, ordinary life of a city that had no idea what it had witnessed in the last year. The slow, unspectacular, entirely real transformation of 2 people who had been living at the edge of their own lives and had finally, separately and together, moved toward the center, where they had always belonged, where they were, at last, completely seen.